Chapter 568. Subsidiary gods. In the information provided by the Sun, there were detailed examples of some typical subsidiary gods, but most of the information didn't provide their true names, only their titles. These included the god of beauty and the goddess of life, who were subsidiaries to vampire ancestor Lilith, the goddess of misfortune, and the god of the dead, who were subsidiaries to annihilation demonic wolf Phlegria, the god of luck, and the queen of calamity, who were subsidiaries to elf king Siniathrim, and so on and so forth. Queen of calamity. Klein suddenly thought of the Book of Calamity and the golden wine cup he had taken from the ruins of the High Elf. The name Kohainum and the word calamity was engraved on it in Elvish. This caused him to make the connection that Kohainum was the elf king's subsidiary, Queen of Calamity. Unfortunately, I can't directly seek confirmation with Little Sunday. I'll have to wait for further information from him. Klein sighed silently. At the same time, he made some theories about the fact that these titles didn't correspond with their true names. The City of Silver was originally the Kingdom of Silver that came under the Giant King's court's rule. Other than having sufficient understanding of its own forces and enemies, the information regarding the other ancient gods will only come from legends and rumors, and they aren't that detailed. Compared to the simple and easy-to-understand titles, a god's true name can consist of complicated and difficult words to remember, which can make it harder for them to be spread. The information provided to Klein when he turned over the page confirmed his theory. However, it gave him new doubts. The dragons also had a dragon of wisdom, which was the equivalent of a god in the City of Silver, called Harabergen, and under Giant King Ormer, there was also his eldest son, the god of dawn, Badheilbrunn, and his queen, the goddess of harvest. Why doesn't the goddess of harvest have a real name? Isn't she the queen of the Giant King's court? The City of Silver should have records of it. These so-called subsidiary gods are equal to the angels or king of angels of later times. Yes, the sequence 2 of their pathway, and sequence 1s of the other pathways? Klein suppressed his perplexion and inferred the truth from the information recorded in the card of blasphemy. Within the same pathway, if there was a sequence 0, then there wouldn't be a sequence 1, and if there was no sequence 0, then there would be at most 3 sequence 1s. However, Klein didn't dare to base his judgment on this. After all, his knowledge was partial, and he didn't even know if there were any preconditions for the sequence 0 and sequence 1, which was derived from the law of Beyonder characteristics conservation and indestructibility. I'll assume this for the time being. Klein leaned back, letting the information in his hands disappear, smiling as he said, "You may begin." At this point, Alger was still seriously examining himself. After considering how to communicate properly, he used the technique of being in the other person's shoes. He started from the point of view of the hermit, who was suspected of being Admiral of Stars, to see what exactly he had exposed. Mr. Fools protects every member's true identity with a blurred and distorted image, but this method doesn't affect the representation of colors. Dark brown colors can be difficult to distinguish, but bright colors are easily grasped. At the very least, I can tell that Miss Justice is blonde with bright green eyes. And for me, the most obvious thing I can't hide is my dark blue hair. But this doesn't say anything. It's not a problem to say that dark blue hair is a common mutation in Beyonders within the Sailor pathway, but the converse isn't true. This is because such traits are hereditary. On Sonia Island and in the Berserk Sea around Desi Bay, they were places where elves originally gathered. Many humans with traces of elvish blood will also have dark blue hair. It's the same for districts where there are a certain number of Church of Storms Beyonders. Ignoring any other trait, it's difficult for the hermit to determine any further information based on the situation. Just as Alger heaved a sigh of relief, he caught sight of the storm robe he was wearing. After returning to the Blue Avenger, not only was he the captain of the ship, but he was also the bishop of the sailors. He often needed to wear the corresponding clothes to celebrate Massachusetts. If he didn't show his devotion in his daily actions, there might come a day when he would be reported by his subordinates. The Church of Storms has always been wary of those members who had been drifting out at sea for a long time, as prolonged acting as pirates might one day turn them into real pirates. In any case, the Lord of Storms has never given a revelation to exclude pirates from his followers. Under the cover of that blurred distortion, it's hard to see the details of one's clothing clearly. This isn't a problem. However, I still have to pay attention in the future. During tarot gatherings, I should change into a set of ordinary clothes. Although I can't be sure, I still have to treat her as a pirate admiral. I can't afford to be careless, Alger thought cautiously. At this moment, he heard the seemingly suppressed voice of the moon Emlyn, which was a result of him being unable to hide his emotions. Mr. Hanged Man, I've done the preparations. When can you obtain the inheritance of that sanguine baron? You mentioned before that it's in the hands of some powerful pirate? You didn't have to say the last sentence. Alger's body instantly stiffened. Powerful pirate? The hermit's eyes swept over the Hanged Man once again. Alger's expression didn't change as he turned his head to the moon and asked, "Have you obtained the funds?" "Of course." Emlyn raised his neck. He originally wanted to wait until the 3-month maturity was up before he went to the bank to withdraw the money, but he soon discovered that he was in a completely different mood after deciding to buy the Sanguine Baron's inheritance. He no longer had any qualms or hesitation. He was filled with expectation and desire, wishing that he could get his hands on it immediately. It was just like how he felt in the past when he was about to buy a beloved doll. He had held back for more than a week before finally giving up by selling the acceptance draft. Although he had lost some money, it was still acceptable. In many situations, an acceptance draft could be used as a currency. "I'll get it for you within the week." Finally, let's confirm the price, £4,500. Is that all right? Seeing that a deal was about to be struck, Alger didn't pursue the moon's act of exposing him. Emlyn thought about the dolls in his room, cleared his throat, and said with his eyes furtively darting around, "Can it be cheaper? It's not up to me to decide, but I can try to acquire it for you at a lower price. Also, don't forget my commission. Let's lower it. How about £300? Alger's tone didn't change at all. "All right." Emlyn exhaled quietly. Not a very powerful vampire, an underaged or a recently matured one. Katlia silently watched from the sidelines and made her judgment. Seeing that the deal between Mr. Hanged Man and Mr. Moon had been concluded in a few sentences, Audrey habitually felt that she should buy something. "In a week or two, I'll contact the members of the Psychology Alchemists in Eastchester County and tell them that I've become a Psychology Alchemist member. I'll exchange my contribution points for the subsequent potion formula. There's no need to make a request to purchase it here for the time being. Once I find out what ingredients are needed, I can ask for everyone's help. There's no need to buy any mystical items for now. I've already had one of them reimbursed. Being able to obtain such rare items with too great a frequency might imply many problems." Audrey's thoughts raced, and she came up with an idea. She turned halfway and looked at the gloomy man at the end of the table. "Mr. World, you mentioned that you have clues to the characteristic left behind by a psychiatrist. Have you successfully acquired it?" "I plan on buying it for Susie," she silently added in her heart. In fact, when she was considering this matter, she had another slightly mischievous idea, which was to find an excuse for Mr. Fool to turn over the Dark Emperor card which sat beside him. From her point of view, Ma'am Hermit was particularly affected by the matter regarding Roselle's diary. And from how her reaction was extraordinarily excessive before she quickly hid it, it was quite possible that she knew about the cards of blasphemy. Therefore, the moment she saw it, she would expose a lot of problems and express the truest thoughts in her heart. But she dismissed the idea in the end, not because she thought it would be bad to sound out Ma'am Hermit, but that this was a way of showing responsibility to both herself and the Tarot Club, and that she shouldn't make decisions for Mr. Fool. He wanted Ma'am Hermit to recognize the card of blasphemy. He definitely would have flipped it open himself. He didn't want to do so, then any attempts would be against his will. Audrey nodded solemnly but almost imperceptibly. At this moment, the World replied hoarsely, "If you're certain that you want it, then I will give it to you as soon as possible. The price is £1,800. Normally, it would be more appropriate to charge £1,200 to £1,500 for a psychiatrist's beyonder characteristic, but Klein had raised the premium slightly to see how much Miss Justice could pay." "All right," Audrey agreed with a light tone. She had paid off the money owed to Viscount Glaint. She had received many gifts for having reached adulthood after returning to her family's fief. It was a time when her finances were in a rather good condition. She had even arranged for the money to be returned to Mr. Fool's Blessed next month. In the future, her monthly income would be above £3,000, and a substantial portion of her normal expenses wasn't going to be borne by her, due to the love of her parents and the results of her previous meritorious exploits. While the two were discussing, the hanged man was somewhat surprised. The world had just sold the faceless Beyonder characteristic the previous time, and he had recently acquired Steele Mavadi's Beyonder characteristic. Yet, he appeared to have a psychiatrist characteristic in his collection, and all of this happened in less than a month. On second thought, Alger quickly came to an understanding. The world represented a group of blessed of Mr. Fool. That might be the harvest from the other blessed. As he imagined this, the world, who was Klein, was in a state of shock towards Miss Justice's opulence. He had thought that Miss Justice, who had just spent £5,500 on a mystical item, wouldn't be as well off as before. It was just like last year, so he had reserved space for her to haggle. Who knew that she would still agree to the deal without hesitation? Has she dug up a gold mine? Klein couldn't help but silently lampoon. Seeing that they had finished their discussion, Derek hurriedly raised his hand, having learned from Miss Justice. Which one of you has the fruit of the Radiant Spirit Pact Tree? He had rather successfully collected the other ingredients of the Solar High Priest potion. Just as Katlia had initially figured out that Miss Justice was a yet-to-advance psychiatrist, she heard this request. After a few seconds of silence, she said, "I do. What can you provide in exchange?" After observing for a long time, she decided to intervene in a small transaction to gain a deeper understanding of how the Tarot Club operated. "I can use the history of the City of Silver or the history of dragons, elves, and other dark creatures to barter," Derek said sincerely. "Ma'am Hermit, this is a list of commonly seen monsters around the City of Silver. You can choose any ingredients you need from it." How honest. Klein almost looked up at the dome of the magnificent palace. What is he talking about? Katlia frowned slightly, momentarily failing to understand a single word from the sun. Chapter 569. A straw will show which way the wind blows. After a brief moment of consideration, the hermit Katlia made the choice that benefited her the most. She said without betraying her emotions, "I'll make a decision after seeing what the commonly seen monsters are around the City of Silver." Another person who gains something without risking anything of her own. Are the people who spend too much time at sea good at fleecing others? Or is little Sun in such a state that makes it impossible to resist fleecing him? Klein instinctively excluded himself from the group of seafarers. All right. Under Justice and Company's scrutiny, Derek didn't hesitate to agree to Ma'am Hermit's request. He recalled the content and conjured it, recording the most commonly seen monsters around the City of Silver into a list. However, it wasn't as detailed as before, and there were quite a few missing. After all, the Sun Pathway's improvement in regards to his memory was rather limited. A few days had passed. Katlia received the piece of information and read through it in a serious manner. The more she scanned through it, the more alarmed she became. This was because the types of monsters had far exceeded her expectations by nearly 100 times. Most of the names used were ancient names. If not for her being a Moses Ascetic Order member who had been pursued by knowledge, and having reached Sequence 5, making her experienced and knowledgeable, there was no way she could have known what these names would really be referring to. But even so, there were still a few monsters she had never heard of. They were like shadows who would never reveal themselves in dreams or imaginations, forever lurking in the depths of the darkness. Where exactly is the City of Silver? Why are there so many monsters? 10 seconds later, Katlia raised her head without a change in expression. She said with a staid tone, "Use the history of your City of Silver in exchange." All right. Derek's eyes lit up as he seemed to see hope in advancing. He soon conjured the historical materials of the City of Silver with the help of Mr. Fool. Having had ample experience, he knew that even more complete and detailed information was worth more than the fruit of a Radiant Spirit Pact Tree. Hence, he retained some of what he knew. Katlia knew that she wasn't Mr. Fool, so it was impossible for her to let the members patiently wait for her to finish reading. Therefore, she casually flipped through it. After confirming its value, she deliberated and asked, "How should I hand over the fruit of the radiant spirit pact tree to you?" Just as she said that, she suddenly thought of something. With a guess, she looked to the end of the long bronze table. "Mr. Fool, is it done by a sacrificial ritual?" This left Audrey, who had prepared the answer, to be clearly stunned. She swallowed the words that she was about to say. Ma'am Hermit is very impressive and knowledgeable. She directly guessed that it's done via a sacrificial and bestowment ritual. Audrey controlled her minute facial expressions as she clicked her tongue and sighed inwardly. Yes. Klein gently nodded without going into detail. He believed that it was impossible for a pirate admiral, a Sequence 5 powerhouse of the Mystery Prior pathway, to not know how a sacrifice was made. This was even something they were good at. Furthermore, she knew the Fool's honorific name, so she didn't lack any of the necessary conditions. Indeed, with a godlike existence bearing witness to a gathering, a sacrificial and bestowment method is the safest and most convenient way of trading. And a conversation through the soul body can result in direct knowledge transfer. Katlia thanked him before saying to the son, "I'll do it as soon as possible." Although she didn't show any abnormalities, her heart was in no way calm. From her casual flipping of the information provided by the son, she discovered that the City of Silver was truly filled with oddities. It included matters about being forsaken by the Lord, how it didn't have a sun, resulting in a state of eternal darkness and high and low-frequency lightning. Matters like how strange and terrifying monsters hid in the darkness when there was no light, and how they survived thanks to black-faced grass. It mentioned that they had survived for more than 2,000 years since the Dark Ages. All of this exceeded Katlia's expectations. As a powerhouse at sea who was knowledgeable and had acquired many secrets, she instantly connected the time and descriptions to a famous concept in history, the cataclysm. Following that, she followed this line of thought and made a further inference. The forsaken land of the gods. Suddenly, the figure she looked up to surfaced in Katlia's mind once again. A sentence filled with an emotive sigh surfaced. He had always been searching for the forsaken land of the gods back when he was alive. He said that the ultimate answer towards everything is hidden there. The sun comes from the forsaken land of the gods which Emperor Roselle couldn't find despite all his efforts? Mr. Fool can connect to that place directly? No, perhaps he awoke from that place. Katlia thought in alarm and solemnity. She had previously belittled the Tarot Club because the moon, justice, and the sun were of low sequences. She believed that with Mr. Fool having awoken only recently, he was obviously unable to pull members of significant strength. However, she now had to reevaluate matters. It involves the forsaken land of the gods, the Church of Storms, the Church of Mother Earth, the lone aristocrats. Perhaps, it's precisely because they're low sequences that these members can be nurtured to be able to reach higher ranks in their respective circles without being suspected. This will allow them to play a more important role. As for me, is it because of the Moses ascetic order or Her Majesty? Katlia seriously analyzed the motives of Mr. Fool. At this moment, the transactions were nearly coming to an end. The moon, the sun, and justice had all confirmed their respective transactions. As for the hermit Katlia, she was still observing. Out of caution, she didn't rashly open her mouth to expose more information about herself. Alger had originally planned on making a request to buy the Sequence 5 Ocean Songster's potion formula so that he could make the subsequent preparations, but with the addition of the hermit, he became especially wary. He gave up on his decision at the last minute and prepared to push it back until he had really advanced to Windblessed. Only with him being stronger would he have the room to breathe. As Furs would be able to obtain the astrologer potion formula and a certain amount of ingredients from her teacher soon, she hadn't prioritized her purchases yet, so all she did was watch silently. She actually curbed her desire to buy a mystical item to make up for her relatively showy trickmaster powers that were lacking in strength, as well as how her apprentice powers were only good for passing through walls and opening doors. However, her real-life circumstances restricted her desires. Up to this day, her savings had exceeded £400. For a member of the middle class, that was rather good, but she clearly remembered how Miss Justice had bought a mystical item for £5,500 previously. Even if it was a relatively average mystical item without significant negative side effects, it will still require £1,000 to £2,000. Furs languidly sat there, unable to open her mouth to make a purchase. Klein controlled the world to scan his surroundings before hoarsely saying, "I need a pair of eyes from a six-winged gargoyle." The supplementary ingredients of a Nimblewright master, Drago bark and the spring water from Sonia Island's Golden Spring, were commonly seen items in the mysterious world. As long as he purchased them at different occasions, he wouldn't garner suspicion from anyone. Therefore, Klein only requested for the eyes of a six-winged gargoyle. The hermit glanced at the world and said without rushing, £300, or the equivalent cost in gold coins. She had noticed that the previous transactions were all made in Loan's gold pound. As expected of the Admiral of Stars who has a pirate crew with an ancient faction backing her. She is very resourceful, and her prices are cheaper than usual. If not for Little Son's imminent advancement, and how he would soon obtain the method for removing the mental corruption of a Beyonder characteristic, I would have even consulted her on this problem. Klein thought as he made the world smile deeply. Okay. With the transaction completed, the palace that resembled a giant's residence fell silent for more than 10 seconds. Without Mr. Fool's reminder, Justice, the Sun, and company knew that they had entered the free exchange segment. The hanged man Alger deliberately looked at Miss Justice and Miss Magician without looking at Ma'am Hermit. Something major recently happened in the Rorstad archipelago. He didn't plan on divulging the world's involvement since it was very likely that Mr. Fool was in possession of the sea god's identity. If he were to rashly confirm this matter, it might spoil Mr. Fool's plans and throw himself into danger. He planned on using a normal tone to mention the happenings on the surface while emphasizing the Moses Ascetic Order member, archaeologist and adventurer, Letitia. He planned on using this to sound out the hermit to figure out if she was Admiral of Stars, Katlia. This was because this pirate admiral was rumored to also be a member of the Moses Ascetic Order. What happened? Justice asked with piqued interest. Alger said calmly, a disguised archaeologist, Letitia, discovered an ancient elvish ruin in Simim Island and took out an item from it. This pushed the deity the locals believed in, sea god Calvetua, to be on the brink of collapse. This fake god wished to create tsunamis to drown the island so that everyone could accompany it in its death, but it was stopped by the Church of Storm's Sea King. Finally, Letitia was found and Calvetua had died. The threat of the tsunamis was leveled, but strangely, the devout believers of the sea god would still occasionally receive responses. Letitia is dead? For an ancient elvish ruin. Katlia had heard of this archaeologist, who was part of the same organization, before, but she wasn't too familiar with her. This was because formal members of the Moses Ascetic Order had to spend a certain amount of time in silent ascetic training. When fully paying attention, she was able to control her powers in a way that significantly exceeded the average person. Therefore, she only seemed slightly stirred as she listened seriously to the hanged man's description without showing any obvious abnormalities. When the hanged man said that Calvetua was dead and how the sea god still responded to its believers, Katlia first frowned in puzzlement before using her spiritual intuition to recall a certain scene. Yesterday, she had seen Mr. Fool hold a milky white scepter when he pulled her above the gray fog. At the tip of the scepter were many tiny blue gems, which were swirling with countless points of holy light. And more importantly, it emanated an aura of godhood, one that seemed like the corporeal aura of the ocean and storm. Katlia instinctively turned her head to the end of the long bronze table, where Mr. Fool was shrouded in the grayish-white fog. Chapter 570. Not admitting or denying, why is she looking at Mr. Fool? Audrey sharply noticed the hermit's subtle motion. This left her somewhat suspicious. From her point of view, this was an atypical response. Mr. Hanged Man was clearly mentioning something that had little to do with everyone. He was talking about the so-called sea god Calvetua's ability to occasionally reply to its believers despite its apparent death. So why would Ma'am Hermit look towards Mr. Fool? Calvetua's death. occasionally replying to its believers. Ma'am Hermit is looking at Mr. Fool? Could it be? Audrey's eyes lit up as she came to a conclusion. Could it be that Mr. Fool is the one replying to Calvetua's believers? Ma'am Hermit knows about this, so? As thoughts whizzed through her mind, Audrey had turned her body halfway to look expectantly at Mr. Fool, who was seated leisurely at the end of the long bronze table. Meanwhile, Alger was also surprised and alarmed about the hermit's unexpected reaction. I was only trying to sound her out about what connection she has with the Moses Ascetic Order member, Letitia. Why would she suddenly turn to look at Mr. Fool? Could it be that she knows that the current sea god is a manifestation of Mr. Fool? Her reaction implies this is highly likely. Before she was recruited into the Tarot Club, did she have a lot of secret exchanges with Mr. Fool, and was already secretly working for him? The more Alger thought, the more he paid attention to the hermit. Then, he subconsciously joined her in looking towards Mr. Fool, who was shrouded in the grayish-white fog. He, the hermit, and Justice turned around at different times, but their nearly unanimous actions made the magician Furs and company notice something amiss. Why are they looking at Mr. Fool? Does sea god Calvetua's death have to do with Mr. Fool? Believing they were smart, Furs and Emlyn began guessing at the reason as they cast their gaze to the end of the long bronze table. Derek didn't know who sea god Calvetua was, nor did he understand what it meant for it to respond to its believers even after its death. However, since everyone was looking at Mr. Fool, he naturally looked over as well. The world was late by a second, as though he was deliberating over something. He first scanned the hanged man, making him shudder in fear. Then he changed the direction of his gaze. At this point, Klein had already come to realize which detail Ma'am Hermit had used to guess that he was the one replying to sea god Calvetua's believers in its stead. He was still stumped over what stance to use. Should I pretend that it's a trivial matter and that I didn't take it to heart, but since you mentioned it, I'll just admit it in passing? Or should I take the stance that since I'm a god, there's no need for me to explain myself to you, so there's no need for me to admit or deny anything? Klein recalled the fool's persona and quickly made a decision. The choice was to neither admit or deny anything, so as to prevent him from losing his standing as a god. However, he would add a single sentence on a particular point, making those who had failed to guess it become more puzzled, while the suspicious ones would be enlightened but would still be left shrouded in confusion as they realized, deep down, how unfathomable Mr. Fool was. With this in mind, Klein, who had leaned back, chuckled. He said leisurely and indifferently, Calvetua became a demigod by relying on a relic left behind by Calamity Kohainum. So they're consulting Mr. Fool about the situation with this sea god. But that doesn't convince me. It feels like there's a deeper truth hidden behind this matter. Could it be? No way, right? Furs frowned as she began coming up with all sorts of thoughts. As expected, Katlia believed Mr. Fool was giving a straightforward answer while also informing them of some secrets. That demigod scepter is Calvetua's characteristic or Calamity Kohainum's relic, or is it something that covers both definitions? Who is Calamity Kohainum? The name sounds elvish. Yes, the hanged man mentioned that Letitia found an ancient elven ruin. It's the residence of a high elf? How did Mr. Fool get that scepter? Did he rely on the hanged man or someone else? No, it doesn't seem like the hanged man, otherwise, he wouldn't have proactively mentioned this matter. What motive does Mr. Fool have behind responding to the sea god's believers? Is this required for his awakening, something that can truly affect reality? The more Katlia thought, the more she found Mr. Fool unfathomable. It was just like how his body was being concealed by the thick gray fog. The clearer she could see him, the more puzzled, horrified, and apprehensive she became. This might be a tussle between gods. Katlia sighed inwardly as the emotions got the better of her. I guessed right. Alger finally verified that the present sea god was a manifestation of the fool. His worries and indecision from before were instantly rewarded. On certain occasions, as a fake sea god believer, I can openly pray. I wonder how much Mr. Fool has recovered. How much of his power can he release from the seal? It's at least at the demigod level. He will be able to provide tremendous protection at sea. The hermit's unsurprised reaction implies that she had long interacted with Mr. Fool and had learned of certain things ahead of time. This implies that her sequence isn't low. She might really be a powerhouse at the pirate admiral level. This is both good and bad news for me. The good news is that I have an additional powerful faction at sea supporting me. At times, we can tacitly cooperate and complete matters that were previously deemed unimaginable. The bad news is that a lot of my news and resource channels will be overshadowed by hers. My purpose in the Tarot Club will drastically decline. Of course, that's under the premise that she really is Admiral of Stars. Yes, I have to adjust my focus from gathering news and resources and align it towards the church. This is something she can't supplant me, Alger thought with joy and wariness. That sea god is really Mr. Fool. No. It should be said that the present sea god is Mr. Fool's manifestation. He has truly begun interfering with the real world? This is great. In the future, I can pray to sea god directly and receive a response when I'm out traveling at sea? Audrey felt surprised, overjoyed, and proud. According to what she knew, the churches didn't do fixed ritualistic magic internally. The ones who received responses by solely praying to the deities were mainly priests or a chance occurrence. Otherwise, they were blessed who just numbered at a handful. As for receiving a response from every prayer, they would be an extreme exception, even among blessed. But I can. Mr. Fool is returning to his throne, one step at a time. Replacing Sea God is one of those steps. Audrey didn't hide the changes in her emotions as she smiled, sitting straight and elegantly. Kohainam? That's an elf's name. I think I've heard someone mention it before. Emlyn attempted to recall, but it was in vain. As for Calvetua's death and how the sea god still replied to its believers, as well as the reason why the hermit, Justice, the hanged man had looked towards Mr. Fool, he had made a slight guess without thinking too deeply about the matter. What has this got to do with me? It doesn't affect my saving of the sanguine, nor is it anything of interest. Anyway, I can just pray to Mr. Fool if there are any problems. Emlyn mumbled to himself, showing disdain towards the emotional changes the others had. Calamity? Queen of Calamity? But there are no records that say that her name is Kohainam. Derek turned his head to the left very slightly, a common tic he did when he recalled things. From the looks of it, Little Son isn't sure if Kohainam is the Queen of Calamity, otherwise, he wouldn't have such a reaction. Klein retracted his gaze in disappointment. He controlled the world to cough, pulling everyone back from their thoughts. Following that, the world conjured a picture with the Fool's help. He showed it to both sides of the table and asked, "Does anyone know her?" It was a picture of the red-haired Helene. Klein mainly wanted to know if Admiral of Stars Katlia or the hanged man Alger knew her. After all, they were well-informed people out at sea. Alger glanced at it, and just as he was about to say that he didn't know her, he heard Ma'am Hermit say with a deep voice, "Red-haired Helene. She's from a fallen noble family and has the bloodline from the Intis's Sauron family." Katlia paused before adding, "She was once a trader out at sea, but she was later said to have been abducted by Ailment Maiden Tracy." Abducted by Ailment Maiden Tracy? I thought it would be some contrived story about a domineering pirate and a noble lady. However, Tracy can be considered a domineering pirate. Klein instantly made some connections. Furs was still lost in her thoughts over the connection between Sea God and the Fool when she suddenly snapped to her senses. She acutely noticed that great opportunities lay in red-haired Helene and Vice Admiral Ailment's story as she began to daydream. To her regret, Ma'am Hermit had only said a few sentences without continuing. The Hermit knows Vice Admiral Ailment. However, that doesn't imply anything. Beyonders of a certain sequence or knowledgeable people will know who the 7 pirate admirals are. Their bounty posters are everywhere. The Hermit is rather aware of matters over at Intis. This is something that can be determined for now. The hanged man wasn't interested in red-haired Helene, only the Hermit's real identity. With red-haired Helene's matter coming to a close, Audrey began considering if she should consult the others about the Mind Dragon. Unlike before, there was now the addition of Ma'am Hermit, who was of unknown character and dubious allegiances. This left her hesitant. After a brief deliberation, she said, I recently sought out the traces of a mind dragon and went to a place which has the tradition of worshipping dragons. She had concealed the exact location as the details might implicate her. Chapter 571. Huge pressure. Audrey simply mentioned the ancient folk song, but she didn't describe the content in detail. She was afraid that the knowledgeable Ma'am Hermit would be able to guess at the exact location. She only mentioned the inspiration she had, and how she used a psychological cue to retain her lucidity in her dream before beginning a magical journey. Psychological cue? She knows how to plant a psychological cue? She's likely a Sequence 7 psychiatrist. Katlia habitually made a judgment, but she immediately felt even more perplexed. Then why would she be buying the beyonder characteristic of a psychiatrist? Taking the same potion gives a limited increase in strength while being prone to losing control. Furthermore, it will be an obstacle towards the digestion of the potion. To create a mystical item? But this will overlap with her own beyonder powers. There's no value to that. To give it to someone else? Amidst Katlia's guesses, Audrey had already mentioned her chaotic dream and how she came to the edge of her conscious. Then, she used the conjuring method she learned from Mr. Fool to create a staircase that led downwards. She then slowly delved deep into her conscious. She didn't describe in detail the various points of light in her subconscious, as it involved embarrassing secrets she didn't wish to share. She focused on her lonely and long journey with no end in sight. She also expressed how there were various monsters hiding in the surrounding grayness that placed immense pressure on her. She mentioned how she nearly broke down several times and barely managed to endure it thanks to her beyonder powers. Then, she reached the point of her finally arriving at the illusory sea of collective subconscious. The memory imprints of the human pioneers and the spread and reflection of the consciousness of the surrounding creatures were presented under Audrey's coherent and unhurried descriptions. Then, it was fixed onto the dragon with grayish stone scales that had flown out from the sea of collective subconscious. There's a dragon that lives in the sea of collective subconscious? What a magical and beautiful journey. Although Miss Justice didn't encounter any enemies or danger, it still leaves me a little surreal. First suddenly thought of a title of a book, Miss Justice's Dream Tour. While rounding things up, Audrey scanned the area and asked, "Ladies and gentlemen, do you have any suggestions? Do you think that the Dragon City of Miracles, Liveseed, is also hidden in the sea of collective subconscious? If I wish to continue searching, what should I take note of? What advanced preparations do I need to make?" The hanged man Alger glanced at the hermit and said in a serious tone, "I don't think you should continue exploring. It's a very dangerous act. According to the records, most dragons are creatures with flesh and blood. This includes the mind dragon. By allowing itself to survive and swim through the so-called sea of collective subconscious, it means that the dragon you saw was a sufficiently high sequence. At the very least, it's at the level of a demigod. Before you reach Sequence 5, it's best that you don't consider this." Katlia nodded and said, "There are many other dangerous things in the sea of collective subconscious. The accumulated maleficent thoughts of humanity, the desires that can corrupt soul bodies, the terrifying memories since ancient times that resemble storms and waves at sea, all of these will deal severe psychological harm to you. It might prevent you from ever waking up. Besides, that's the sea of collective subconscious of all creatures, which isn't only limited to humans. There might be evil spirits, evil gods, or the consciousness of some terrifying existence hidden in there. They're like gigantic maelstrom that can devour ships. Before you truly acquire beyonder powers that allow you to travel through the sea of collective subconscious, it's best not to rashly explore too deeply." Audrey, who was filled with expectations, felt disappointed. However, she couldn't help but admit that Mr. Hanged Man and Ma'am Hermit had spoken very logically and sincerely. She silently inhaled and said to herself, "Audrey, don't be headstrong. Wait till you're Sequence 5 before making the attempt again." She totally didn't consider how difficult it was to become a Sequence 5. At that level, one could even compete to become one of the 7 pirate admirals, or even make the 7 become 8. From Audrey's point of view, With Mr. Fool and the Tarot Club, as long as she was careful and calm, she would definitely be able to successfully attain that level in a year or two if she didn't take unnecessary risks. Only the gate to being a demigod was hard to push open. Ma'am Hermit knows a lot and is very knowledgeable. Audrey clung onto the last sliver of hope and looked towards Mr. Fool at the end of the table, hoping that this godlike existence would provide a suggestion that was different from Mr. Hanged Man or Ma'am Hermit. Don't look at me. I have no idea. Klein tried his best not to blink. His understanding of the conscious, subconscious, and the collective subconscious was still stuck at a theoretical level that Spirit Medium Daily had described. He didn't understand anything more. Despite having his dreams intruded frequently, he had never thought of exploring the world outside the dream despite retaining his lucidity. Therefore, how was he to provide any suggestions to Miss Justice? In fact, he had a natural idea regarding this. However, he wasn't sure if it would work without having done any verification. In the past, even if he lacked the confidence, he could vaguely make a comment, but now, with Admiral of Stars Catlia sitting at the side, watching, it only made it easier for him to make mistakes the more he spoke. The less he spoke, the fewer mistakes he would commit. And there was no chance of making mistakes by keeping silent. What a pressure-inducing new member. Klein sighed inwardly. He didn't say a word and maintained his faint smile. If not for him being above the gray fog and how he existed in the form of a spirit body, he suspected that such highly difficult acting would make the muscles around his eyes spasm. Mr. Fool doesn't have any suggestions. Audrey retracted her gaze in depression. She stopped fantasizing about exploring the sea of collective subconscious so soon. At this moment, the Moon Emlyn, who was already turning impatient, cleared his throat. I've seriously researched the history handed down by us Sanguine. He really is a vampire. Nurturing vampires and pulling vampires into the church is really a tradition of the Church of Mother Earth. Catlia nodded as she looked like she was listening seriously. Meanwhile, she felt that some of her conclusions needed adjustments. The moon directly expressed his identity. Does this mean that Mr. Fool has a potent deterrence, even in the outside world, that the members aren't afraid of information being leaked? It seems like I don't have to completely hide my circumstances. Emlyn paused and looked at the sun before tipping his chin. Before the cataclysm, there was no city of silver, only the kingdom of silver. If it were anyone else who had thrown such doubt on him, Derek would have hastened to retort, expressing the fact that the people of the City of Silver were descendants of the Kingdom of Silver and that he hadn't lied. However, after glancing at Mr. Moon and sensing his smugness, Derek turned his head to the side, feeling that an explanation was beneath him. Why must I let an arrogant vampire who doesn't acknowledge the City of Silver's history believe me? He thought silently to himself. From his reaction, Emlyn could tell that the City of Silver was indeed related to the Kingdom of Silver. He sked and said, the faith of the Kingdom of Silver wasn't originally Giant King Ormer, but his Queen Omabella. Omabella? Derek turned his head and blurted out, our City of Silver has no records of this matter, nor are there any records of a queen named Omabella. Emlyn chuckled and spread out his hands. That's why, there's nothing wrong with me saying that your City of Silver's history is flawed and incomplete, right? Clearly, there are mistakes in your records of sanguine history. You took such a roundabout way to prove this. Should I say that a vampire like you has clear logic, or that you're someone who bears grudges? Klein held back his laughter and stopped himself from sizing up Emlyn White. The moon and the sun's debate benefited him greatly, allowing him to know that the giant queen, the goddess of harvest, was named Omabella. The sun Derek was just about to give a retort to Mr. Moon when he heard Ma'am Hermit speak. Omabella is the goddess of harvest from the second epic. She's also the queen of the giant king's court. Legend has it that she perished at the end of the second epic, but it's impossible to verify since no one has seen her corpse or relics. The goddess of harvest is really named Omabella. Derek was stunned. He wished to retort, but he was unable to say a word as this matter proved that the history of the City of Silver had several holes. He instantly felt somewhat aggrieved. When Emlyn saw this, he felt good. Pleasure rose from the depths of his heart. After another round of exchanges, the tarot gathering came to an end. Klein smiled and said, "Everyone, we shall meet next week." "By your will." Audrey immediately got up to bow. The others weren't any slower, including the hermit Katlia. Upon returning to reality, Admiral of Stars Katlia looked at the shattered celestial globe on her desk. She then seriously recalled what had happened at the gathering. A few details made her believe that the Tarot Club involved itself in many matters that made it nothing to scoff at. And hidden deep in the gray fog was Mr. Fool. Like the world, who was hidden behind thick shadows, he was unreadable and unfathomable. It was unknown what he was planning. After more than 10 seconds of silence, Katlia retrieved a pen and some paper and wrote while deliberating, "Someone has been deliberately collecting the Emperor's diary pages." She didn't dare to expose any information that involved the Tarot Club, as she was afraid of being punished by Mr. Fool. All she could do was give a heads up on things that could be discovered under ordinary circumstances. After she was done writing and folding the letter, she took out a golden, exquisite harmonica she carried with her. Putting it to her lips, she blew it. In the blink of an eye, she saw the letter strangely vanish. Even though she wasn't wearing her glasses, she was unable to discover the arrival of the messenger. Phew. Katlia sighed and reached for her forehead and said silently, "The pressure is really huge when participating in a gathering while under the supervision of a god. With Admiral of Stars joining, the pressure on me as the Fool has greatly increased." Klein rubbed his temples above the gray fog and directly returned to the real world. He wanted to attempt the inspiration Miss Justice had received from exploring her dreams. Chapter 572. Recite my name. After a series of chores, Klein opened his locked bedroom door and looked into the living room. He saw Danitz sleeping soundly on a reclining chair. Although he had long heard it, Klein couldn't help but lampoon. "It's not even 4 in the afternoon. Has this guy completely let his hair down now that he doesn't need to monitor the radio transceiver?" With a thought, he gradually smiled, feeling that this was exactly what he needed. The premise of him maintaining his lucidity in dreams had involved someone invading his consciousness. Typically, his dreams were a turbid mess, which meant that he alone wasn't able to complete the experiment. After all, he couldn't plant a psychological cue on himself. Therefore, he planned on using external forces to enter the dreams of others. This way, he could maintain his lucidity like a nightmare. He originally planned on heading out to find a suitable target, but Danitz's posture was in such a perfect state that he could hardly stop himself from kicking him. "No, I should be experimenting." Klein corrected his thoughts. He contemplated for a moment and didn't use a dream charm. As a Sequence 7 pyromaniac, with the ancient name being Fire Mage, Danitz's spiritual perception wasn't to be written off. Once he softly chanted an incantation that could stir the powers of nature, Danitz would definitely be awoken. As such, it would be a question of whether he could evade the matter in a timely fashion. After some deliberation, Klein took out another thing he had prepared. It was a gem-like object that seemed dark and deep. It was the beyonder characteristic left behind by a nightmare. It could be used to a certain extent, just like Nimblewright Master Rosego's all-black eye. However, the effects were inferior to one that was from a mystical item. For example, this nightmare beyonder characteristic didn't allow Klein to pass through the dreams of someone across the city from his inn suite, nor was he able to forcefully pull people into a dream. However, it was still simple enough to perform the most basic form of intruding into someone's dream at a close distance. Klein held the dark gem and spread out his spirituality. The illusory darkness rapidly spread before his eyes, filling his vision. Everything before his eyes were blanketed over, including Danitz. There was no longer a humanoid figure but an ellipsoidal blob of light. Klein immediately extended his spirituality out and made contact with it. Without any warning, various scenes flooded his surroundings as they flashed rapidly. Finally, it came to stop on a ship that was dozens of meters long. It had a smoke-churning chimney and large sails that were fully raised. The deck was polished abnormally bright, shimmering with the glimmer of a gold coin when sunlight hit it. Danitz stood under the main cannon as he had his arms crossed. He was leisurely rushing the sailors, shouting from time to time, "Scrub that area again. Dogs hit. Do you wish to copy down the ancient Fasak dictionary? This fellow is quite impressive on the Golden Dream. Klein ignored the owner of the dream and flew to the other end of the ship. He found a hidden spot and landed on the deck before preparing to test his spiritual perception. What he planned on experimenting on was simple. He wanted to know if chanting the fool's honorific name in a dream was effective. He wanted to know if he could sense someone praying. This way, if Miss Justice encounters danger in the sea of collective subconscious, she can use this method to seek help. After stretching his back, Klein's expression gradually turned solemn as he softly said, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck." With the words in Hermes being spoken, he very quickly finished reciting the fool's honorific name. However, Klein didn't hear the series of illusory pleas. "It doesn't work?" Klein frowned in thought. He analyzed whether it was really impossible, or if he had made a mistake somewhere. Chanting in the dream doesn't actually produce any noise. Relying on Hermes alone isn't sufficient. To achieve the effects of praying, I'll have to use a language like ancient Hermes that can stir the powers of nature. This is the same state as me copying the account password of my anonymous account. Klein nodded slightly and began to chant his honorific name in ancient Hermes. He wasn't afraid that there would be an accident, but that his stirring of the powers of nature would wake blazing Danitz from his sleep. He recited each word, quickly finishing the 3 sentences. Following that, Klein heard the stacked series of irritable and illusory pleas. At that moment, Danitz's dream quivered as the Golden Dream quickly disintegrated. Klein didn't stay any longer and immediately left. He returned back to his bedroom before Danitz woke up. After 7 to 8 seconds, Danitz sat up in a daze as he muttered to himself in fear, "Why did I dream of that madman German Sparrow causing trouble on the Golden Dream? What a terrifying matter. Dogs it. It must be the result of me worrying over this matter all this time." Inside the bedroom, Klein had already taken 4 steps counterclockwise and gone above the gray fog. Without any surprises, he saw a rippling light by the fool's high-back chair. And it was the scene of him in the dream. It really works. One can still receive a response when chanting the fool's honorific name in languages such as ancient Hermes or Jotun. It's no wonder some people might suddenly die in their sleep despite not doing a thing. They might be reading some materials or had memorized certain symbols in the day and accidentally replicated them in the dream. The danger in this world really cannot be prevented. Klein dispelled the rippling light and considered if he should inform Miss Justice of the results of the experiment. To only inform her later instead of saying it on the spot is a little damaging to the fool's image. But Miss Justice is the kind of girl with a huge sense of curiosity. Although she has been warned by Mr. Hanged Man and Admiral of Stars, and even if she's a little more mature now, there's still the chance of her taking risks. Of course, if anything were to happen, it's on herself and it has nothing to do with me. Klein couldn't help but recall Miss Justice's adoration of the fool and the thought of her optimism and cheerfulness that brought him happiness, as well as her contributions towards the Tarot Club all this time. Finally, he sighed and said in a self-deprecating manner, "I still need to inform her and give a warning. This is the treatment a VIP gets." After making the decision, Klein didn't hesitate to spread out his spirituality to touch the crimson star representing Miss Justice. In a room of the huge manor in East Chester County, Audrey had her legs leaning sideways as she sat before her dressing table. She was recalling the words Mr. Hanged Man and Ma'am Hermit had said. After being warned by 2 senior Beyonders, she suddenly realized something. It wasn't that the mid and upper echelons of the psychology alchemists wasn't aware that one could explore dreams, the icy mountain of the subconscious, and the sea of collective subconscious by using a self-induced psychological cue. The reason why they didn't tell me anything is because it's too dangerous for a psychiatrist. Many people have already died in such explorations. But they should warn me. Alright. From their point of view, I'm only a sequence 8 telepathist. I'm not equipped with the powers of a psychological cue, so there was no need to warn me. Audrey finally understood the perplexing matter. Just as she was about to let Susie enter the room to calm the disappointment in her heart, she suddenly saw thick gray fog spew out, instantly flooding her vision. In the middle of the endless grayish-white, a figure sat in a high-backed chair. Looking down at her, it said, "Do not make attempts without careful consideration." Before Audrey realized what was happening, she heard the deep and majestic voice sound out again. "If you encounter dangers in your dreams, you can recite my name." Recite your name? Audrey's eyes widened as she became overjoyed. "Yes, Mr. Fool." Seeing that Miss Justice was excited instead of showing any doubts, Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief and chuckled. "Use ancient Hermes." With that said, his figure faded away and the gray fog vanished. Audrey sat there stunned for 2 seconds before hurriedly pursing her lips, afraid that she wasn't on her best behavior. "Mr. Fool actually specially warned me. He even permitted me to recite his name in my dream." Audrey excitedly took a few steps on the spot, believing that she had really become a blessed of God. Of course, she also remembered Mr. Fool's warning. She planned to understand more from the psychology alchemists and make another attempt only when she was sufficiently prepared. The corners of her mouth curled up slightly as she randomly tapped her chest, saying silently, "May Mr. Fool watch over me." Above the gray fog, Klein began to consider another matter. Red-haired Helene, who had a reward worth £1,000, was actually related to Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. Tracy took over Kalangos' crew and changed his flagship to the Black Death. As for Kalangos, he previously plundered a tycoon named Jimmy Necker. That tycoon had previously obtained parts of Death's Chronicles. It came from a Balam royal family's mausoleum. This information came from that nightmare inside Creeping Hunger. It should benefit Mr. Azek to a certain extent. I can also investigate the matter in passing. Klein found another reason to look forward to finding red-haired Helene. He originally planned on using the magic mirror, a Rhodes, to find her, but now he planned on mobilizing sea god believers to perform a search. In the past, it's quite demeaning to send a revelation for just £1,000. But now that it involves a pirate admiral, it can barely make people guess that there are secret motives behind it. Klein conjured red-haired Helene's photo and summoned the sea god scepter. He had never done a mass revelation, so it was possible that it would be a burden that he couldn't withstand. He chose higher-ups like Kalat and Edmonton. With waves reaching high into the sky as a background, he said in a deep voice, "Find her and protect her. Be careful of Tracy's forces." Klein didn't provide further explanations as he broke down this scene along with red-haired Helene's photo into many sets before projecting them into the corresponding dots of light. Chapter 573, Teaching a Lesson in Reality in a Forest in Blue Mountain Island where the resistance base was located. Sitting in a wheelchair, Kalat raised his bald head and looked towards the sunlight that was scattering at the cave's entrance. His eyes couldn't hide his joy. He acutely sensed that ever since God reappeared over the land and stated his 10 Commandments, the previous bloodshed and chaos had changed. From time to time, he would provide them with guidance which was filled with wisdom. Furthermore, he would observe all creatures and proactively interfere with the situation at sea in a bid to help the resistance and everyone in Rorsted, allowing them to pass through a difficult, thorny path while still being able to see some hope. Perhaps this is the true meaning behind his reappearance over the land. Kalat recalled the revelation he had just received and guessed that the red-haired woman named Helene was like a fulcrum for Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy and the forces out at sea. She was the key to spoiling the balance between the countries, and only by making the world's situation more chaotic would the people of Rorsted receive the opportunity of being liberated. Kalat drew in a breath and quickly set up a ritual to pray to Sea God, conjuring Helene's picture. After doing all of this, he instinctively turned his head to the side and wore a somewhat mixed expression. Living in that direction was the high priest of the Church of Sea God, a priest who was a high-ranking member of the resistance. Although they don't dare go against the revelations and have made tremendous changes, in many ways, they're still immersed in the past. They're obstinate, conservative, backward, and savage. They refuse to embrace a more civilized church. If this goes on, they'll one day be abandoned by God. Kalat couldn't hide the smile in his heart while he felt a strong sense of anguish. After scanning through all the believers' prayers and picking a few to respond to, Klein returned to the real world. He planned on heading out to search for a chance to enact true acting. When his right hand gripped the door handle, a ridiculous but possible thought came to his mind. My true goal is not to find red-haired Helene, but to use this opportunity to get to Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy and figure out what happened to Tycoon Jimmy Necker, so as to get to know the location of the ancient chronicles of death. That is to say, I only need to lure Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy out with red-haired Helene. As for whether she's the real person or not, that doesn't matter. I can make myself red-haired Helene and let Danitz send me to Strongman Ozeal, get the reward, and easily meet Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. What an impressive sequence of actions. Klein suddenly shook his head as he found a reason to reject the idea. Although I'm a faceless, I can't accept wearing drag. Could it be that overcoming my inner resistance is also one of the principles for acting? Furthermore, I don't know red-haired Helene. Acting as her wouldn't work. I would just be like her on the surface, and I wouldn't be able to fool people who are familiar with her. That way, I won't be able to meet Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. The person searching for red-haired Helene might not be Tracy, but an enemy of hers. I don't know Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy's background. Rashly doing such an act would result in immeasurable danger. It's best to be safe and abide by my wishes. I'll first search for red-haired Helene, and after determining the details, I can consider the subsequent actions. At that moment, Klein suddenly felt that something was amiss in the living room. Danitz's snoring had softened, and the time between each snore shortened. Vice Admiral Iceberg is here? Klein turned the handle and opened the door to the bedroom. While making this silent action, Danitz sat up with his eyes open. He tried hard to hide his smile as he said, "Captain came. She said that Admiral of Blood's crew was sighted at Longtail Island and is continuing south. His destination seems to be the Berserk Sea. The source of the news is trustworthy." Longtail Island? The island at the southern end of the Rorsted Sea? From the looks of it, Admiral of Blood previously planned on coming to Byam, but the fight between Calvetua and Sea King John Cotman scared him away. He circled around the area and headed straight for the Berserk Sea. Yes, it's probably because his intelligence officer, Old Quinn, didn't send a telegram to inform him. Klein felt pangs of regret and could only lament how reality changed faster than his plans. He had planned to make his hunt of Admiral of Blood become the crowning battle of the crazy adventurer and bounty hunter, Gehrman Sparrow. Killing a single steel Mavadi ultimately lacks that shock and awe effect. Klein didn't say a word as he calmly looked at Danitz. Danitz felt a little uneasy from the intense stare as he gave a hollow chuckle. Admiral of Blood has fled. Your cooperation with Captain has come to an end, right? I can now return to the Golden Dream, right? Further developments can be done via your messenger. Klein pondered for a moment and took out a piece of paper from his pocket. He scribbled the method to summon his messenger. Following that, he flicked his wrist, sending the piece of paper out like a metallic plate. Danitz was a hunter at Sequence 9, so he easily reached out and caught the piece of paper. He scanned it before a scarlet flame rose in his palms, burning the paper to ashes. Even if I forget it, Captain will have a way of making me recall it. He paused and squeezed out a smile before asking again, I can now return to the Golden Dream, right? Klein nodded slightly and said, yes. I can. Danitz held back his urge to pump his fist in celebration, afraid that he would end up antagonizing the madman, Gehrman Sparrow. He smiled cautiously and said, I'll first pay off the room for this period of time and buy a ship ticket. As you know, Byam hasn't been calm recently. Captain doesn't wish for the Golden Dream to dock at the harbor here. At least you know how to settle the room's payment. Klein didn't say a word as he maintained his austere attitude. He draped himself with a coat and took his hat before walking towards his luxurious suite. When his back disappeared into the corner of a staircase and vanished from Danitz's sight, Danitz shrank back into his room and clenched his fist, pumping them into the air. Wonderful! Wonderful! I'm finally free! He didn't delay in wearing his cap and heading to the front desk of the Wind of Azure Inn to settle the bill. He informed them that this didn't mean that he was checking out. Danitz quickly hit the streets and ran straight for a place known as the Seaweed Bar. He found the air fresh and invigorating. After he took a few steps, he suddenly noticed bounty posters pasted along the walls around a bend. Blazing Danitz, 5,500 pounds. The posters were just 2 steps away from Danitz. That familiar face allowed for a clear comparison with his cap-wearing face. Danitz clenched his teeth and revealed a sorrowful smile. He hurriedly pressed down his cap, nearly concealing his normal line of sight. But even so, he still felt uneasy. He went to a recent department store and bought a gray scarf. He wrapped it around his neck and hid his nose and mouth in it. At this point in time, Danitz relaxed somewhat as he sped up his pace and rushed for his destination. The Seaweed Bar was a place where gangs gathered. It was common for infamous pirates to appear there. Although this place wasn't like the Swordfish Bar or a Mirror's Leaf Bar that allowed access to a lot of information and resources, it had its own unique niche. It had many resourceful secret channels. What Danitz wanted to do was buy a scalped ticket to Galagos, as this wouldn't need him to provide any identification. He knew very well that be it in the past or present, his bounty poster would be plastered across all the ticket booths. He had bought the first-class tickets to the White Agate via the same method as well. After entering the bar, Danitz didn't take off his cap and scarf. He carefully surveyed the area and found Daniel, who sold scalped tickets. He didn't directly approach him and instead retracted his gaze from the thin and somewhat swarthy man who was in his 30s. He began searching for someone unfamiliar. After a round of choices, Danitz squeezed through the crowd and arrived beside a lad who was drinking at the bar counter. He tapped him on the shoulder and suppressed his voice. "Do me a favor." "What?" The lad turned his head warily and ended up seeing a suspicious man. The lower half of his face was covered in a gray scarf and the cap on his head nearly hid his eyes. He revealed almost nothing about his face. Such a dress-up simply meant that he was suspicious. This was because the Rorstad archipelago's lowest temperature during the winter was about 10 degrees Celsius. Danitz pointed at Daniel. "See that guy over there? Buy me a ticket for Galagos tomorrow." He handed over 3 one-pound notes and chuckled. "The rest is yours." Although a scalped ticket was much more expensive than a retail ticket, Galagos wasn't too far, making £3 more than sufficient. Of course, this was also because the journey was relatively shorter and there was no need for him to buy a first-class ticket. The reason why Danitz didn't buy it himself was because he was worried that Daniel would recognize him, bringing him unwanted trouble. Back when his bounty was only £3,000, pirates and adventurers at his level or lower had to consider how many people were needed to take him down. The bounty received wasn't something that could make them forget about their fear towards Vice Admiral Iceberg and the risk of losing their lives. Hence, very few people would take the initiative to attack him. As such, his safety was pretty much guaranteed in such black markets. But now, his bounty reward had already reached £5,500. Even if several people joined forces, the amount of money each of them could get was a sizable sum. Furthermore, there were many people out at sea who were desperados. Apart from that, there would be people who found their own bounties too low and wished to prove their strength. These people would definitely challenge a target like Danitz, who was infamous but was of little risk. It was precisely because of this that Danitz was afraid that Daniel would betray him. Therefore, he hired a random person to buy it on his behalf. The lad held the cash and gave Danitz another look before getting up from his seat. He then walked towards Daniel. He deliberately slowed down his footsteps when he walked past some drunkards as he whispered to them. When Danitz saw this scene, he suddenly became guarded. He thought of a problem. With him acting suspiciously, it was very obvious that there was a problem with him. He was a perfect target for being betrayed. "Heh, do you think my reputation as blazing was bought?" Danitz planned on teaching the lad a lesson after he obtained the ticket. At this point, he discovered that a familiar figure had walked in. He was an infamous pirate, Blue Eyes Meath, with a bounty of £2,800. And this pirate clearly knew this group of people were planning to betray him. Blue Eyes Meath still has a few rather powerful subordinates. Danitz didn't hesitate to get up and head for the bar's back door. His speed increased as he agilely forced himself through the drunkards and escaped from the bar. Then, with his rich anti-tracking skills, he completely escaped from the group of people. Danitz didn't dare to stay on the streets since it was already dark. The patrolling police and soldiers would begin increasing. He went straight back to the Wind of Azure Inn and opened the door to the luxurious suite. Inside, he saw Gehrman Sparrow admiring the dusk. Danitz had a thought as he forced a smile. "There's something. I forgot to mention it just now. Captain wishes to ask if you have any interest in meeting her at Galagos?" This was a question he had previously kept secret. He had planned on returning and telling his captain that Gehrman Sparrow wasn't interested. But now, he realized that he had a low chance of surviving in Byam once he was separated from the crazy adventurer. Chapter 574. Failed to accomplish. Head to Galagos to meet Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards? Klein was taken aback, nearly frowning in the process. This wasn't something he considered unacceptable, but instead a chance for him to use this face-to-face meeting to ask about matters with trite details that were cumbersome to pen down. It was possible for him to be inspired and gain information for his subsequent advancement and high-sequence potion formulas. One more friend, one more channel. Klein silently muttered this sentence before taking out a heavy gold coin. He divined if there was any danger in front of blazing Danitz. The shiny gold coin flipped into the air and tumbled down into Klein's palm, tails facing up. This implied a negative response, which meant that there wasn't much danger meeting Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina in Galagos. Klein shifted his gaze upwards at Danitz and calmly said, "Okay. On the captain's behalf, I thank you for accepting the invitation." Danitz heaved a sigh of relief and beamed, his brows easing. Klein took a look at the wall clock and said, "I'll first head to the washroom." "Head to the washroom? You mean you plan on heading out later to buy a ticket for me?" Danitz's gaze followed Gehrman Sparrow's body as he sharply read in between the lines. After using spirit dowsing to confirm things above the gray fog, Klein washed his hands and left the washroom and said to Danitz, "Let's go." "Me?" Danitz pointed at himself. Klein put on his coat and nodded. "There's no need to, right? You can directly find Elland and get him to help us buy 2 tickets." In this rare occasion, Danitz sincerely provided a suggestion. Klein coldly swept his glance across him and didn't say a word. He wore his hat and went out the door. Danitz trembled and swallowed his second suggestion of buying fake identification documents and use Gehrman Sparrow's ability to change appearances to buy 2 tickets via official channels. He wrapped the scarf around him once again and pressed down on his cap before quickly following Gehrman Sparrow. After nearly 20 minutes, Klein pointed ahead where there was a noisy commotion. "Is it there?" That was the seaweed bar where Danitz had failed to accomplish the purchase of scalped tickets. Yes, Danitz never expected them to circle over and was momentarily stunned. Along the way, he had roughly described his early experience. Therefore, he wasn't sure why Gehrman Sparrow would return here. Amid his thought, he suddenly had a guess as he blurted, "Are you going to seek revenge for me? This fellow might be crazy, but he's quite nice to his friends." His act of venturing out into Bansi Harbor for Elland and the others is an example. Danitz couldn't help but reflect on the matter. Klein shot him a glance and didn't say a word. He widened his strides and walked into the seaweed bar. "There's really no need," Danitz followed behind as he weakly persuaded him. To him, if he wasn't afraid of escalating the matter, he would have baked those bunch of backstabbing bastards in cement and sank them to the bottom of the sea. The bar was noisy and lively, with local music reverberating through it, bringing about a trance-like feeling. Danitz seriously surveyed the area in an attempt to find the bunch of backstabbers, as well as the infamous pirate, Blue Eyes Meath. "That's Daniel," Danitz casually introduced the black market merchant. "What a pity that this place is just too chaotic. I've no idea if that group of people are still around," he thought with some regret. Klein traced his gaze and touched creeping hunger with his right hand. He turned his head and looked at Danitz, saying with his usual expression, "Take off your scarf." His tone was akin to instructing Danitz to buy a glass of beer. Danitz was left stunned on the spot as he wondered if he had heard wrong. Klein widened the ends of his mouth and said, "Take off your scarf. Do not make me repeat thrice." "Why?" Danitz choked back his question under the icy cold and crazy stare. He blankly removed his scarf in puzzlement, and he had a baffling feeling that the people around him were sizing him up and also recognizing him as the great pirate worth 5,500 pounds, Blazing Danitz. Klein maintained his smile that concealed madness and continued instructing, "Take off your cap. Go over and buy a ticket." In an instant, Danitz felt as though he had been struck by lightning. He nearly leaped up. "I'll be recognized." Under Gairman Sparrow's stare, his voice became softer and softer. At this point in time, he had already understood what Gairman Sparrow was up to. "He wishes to use my worth as 5,500 pounds as bait to fish out those greedy pirates and powerhouses behind those gangs. Dogs it. To think I thought he was nice to his friends a moment ago. No, why would I even consider him my friend? This son of a bitch." Danitz kept cursing inwardly with vulgarities. He couldn't put up any resistance since he knew how crazy Gairman Sparrow was. This was a madman who was even thinking of hunting a pirate admiral. Danitz revealed a twisted smile. As he slowly turned his head back, he took off his cap and slowly walked towards Daniel. Around him, gazes swept past him and paused for 2 seconds before they were retracted. As the drunkards moved away from him like the receding tide, they opened a wide path for him as though the ocean was split. Upon seeing their reaction, Danitz was surprised at this turn of events despite his horror and concerns. This is the might of a great pirate? This is what it feels like to be the center of attention? Damn it, I heard someone say my name. Someone is whispering Blazing. Danitz knew he had been recognized. As he walked forward anxiously, he hung his hands down and prepared to do battle. Among the crowd, Blue Eyes Meath blurted out, "Danitz? Blazing Danitz." His subordinates exchanged looks and said excitedly, "Boss, it's really Blazing Danitz. 5,500 pounds. Shall we attack?" Meath narrowed his azure blue eyes and raised his left arm, slapping the back of his subordinate's head. "You stupid ass. If Blazing Danitz were a stupid ass like you, he would have been killed numerous times. He dared to appear here because he's not afraid of being attacked. He has a powerhouse hiding behind him?" Meath suddenly felt horrified as he looked around. He suspected that Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards had secretly arrived in the city of Generosity, Byam. Through the gaps in between the crowd, he saw a young gentleman in a black double-breasted frock coat. He wore a half-top hat and had black hair and brown eyes. He looked thin, but he had an angled face. Without any words, Meath's spiritual perception told him that this was a terrifying existence. His high spiritual perception had previously brought him numerous troubles, but it had also helped him successfully evade even more dangers. "Let's go," he suppressed his voice as he ordered. Then, with the help of the patrons blocking him, he fled from the bar's back door just like how Danitz did previously. Danitz came right in front of Daniel while shuddering in fear before buying 2 tickets to Galagos from a blank and horrified opponent. Even after he returned the way he came and received the signal from Gairman Sparrow to walk out the bar, he didn't notice anyone suddenly assaulting him. Isn't it said that there are many desperados among pirates? Indeed, a last-minute and rush trap is hardly effective. Something abnormal usually implies that something is amiss. Of course, one can use the abnormality to scare the enemy. Unfortunately, Klein pressed down on his hat before following Danitz out. At that moment in time, Danitz was loitering around a street lamp. When he saw Gairman Sparrow walk out, he barely smiled and said, "Can I wear the scarf and cap already?" "Haha, that group of cowards." "Yes." Klein didn't stop as he sped up once he reached the other end of the street. Danitz's pupils contracted as he hurriedly chased after him and inquired, "Why are we suddenly running?" Klein didn't turn his head as he calmly said, "Do you wish to stay here to be invited back by the mandated punishers?" As he spoke, he took out a paper figurine, threw it out, and burned it to ashes. Only then did Danitz snap to his senses. Although that group of cowards didn't dare to attack him, they definitely had the courage to report him. If he was successfully taken down, they still had a chance of receiving parts of the reward. They ran all the way into a secluded alley before Gairman Sparrow stopped. Only then did Danitz have the time to wrap his scarf properly and wear his cap. "Where are we heading now?" Danitz asked with a slight pant. Klein glanced at him. "Find Eland." The corners of Danit's mouth twitched, yearning to throw a fireball over. "To buy tickets to the Dylinius Island," Klein added as he passed through the alley. Dylinius Island was the first island past the south of the Rørsted archipelago. "Right, there's a ship there that heads for Galagos." Now, with everyone's attention focused on the liners from Byam to Galagos, no one would imagine that we'd take a detour to Dylinius Island and travel from there. Danitz followed as he was enlightened. On Tuesday morning, Klein personally helped Danitz don a disguise, making him look like a mixed blood who wore gold-rimmed glasses. Although there was no way to use his faceless powers, it was still at least 10 times better than Danitz's own attempts at disguising himself. They successfully boarded the ship and prepared to head south to Dylinius Island harbor. The journey was expected to take 10 hours. The liner left the harbor and steered into the sea. Under the bright sunlight, thin clouds, and blue skies, this hybrid-powered ship silently sailed through the gentle waves amid the cold breeze all the way into the afternoon. At this moment, Klein was inside the cabin, pondering over some content in the Book of Secrets. Danitz was pacing about, thinking about how he could brag to his mates. Suddenly, their vision darkened as though a cloud had drifted over to blot out the sun. Klein subconsciously looked out and saw that a gigantic pitch-black sailboat had appeared at some moment in time. It was nearly 100 meters long and had its sail fully opened. By the side were rows of cannons. Before it approached, it steered in a different direction, but it still made the surroundings seem to have a black sun pass by. Danitz revealed a reverent and apprehensive expression that was mixed with a longing but abhorrent look. He hissed before whispering in a dreamy manner, "Dark Emperor." Chapter 575. Golden Dream. Upon seeing the gigantic black sailboat, Klein's first reaction was fear and wariness. He suspected that the demigod, king of the five seas Nast, was here for him. But he quickly refuted that guess. This was because, apart from using the Dark Emperor card in the spirit world, he had nearly never made the card of blasphemy appear in the real world ever since he came out to sea. There were only 2 or 3 times when they appeared due to a summoning before it quickly entered the spirit world. With the gray fog screening abilities and the card of blasphemy's anti-divination and anti-prophecy traits, it's impossible for Nast to lock onto me. Klein calmed down as he got up to walk towards the window. Together with Danitz, he looked at the Dark Emperor, which defied sailboat logic. The gigantic ship slowly approached in the massive shadows as the scene on the deck became increasingly clear. The sailors were either washing the deck or bragging on the shipboard. None of them had drawn their cutlasses or guns. There was no sign of them planning to plunder the ship. Near the cabin, there was a mottled stone chair that was 2 to 3 meters high. On it sat a colossal man that was comparable to a giant. Before he could take in Nast's appearance, Danitz couldn't help but lower his head as his body became numb and trembled, to the point of prostrating himself. Klein also sensed the inexplicable sense of might and awe. He didn't forcibly resist it to keep his head up and continue looking at Nast. This had a high chance of attracting his attention, bringing him unwanted trouble. As a person with many secrets, he had to bow his head when required. Klein retracted his gaze as he admired the rugs on the deck. After an unknown period of time, he saw the sunlight illuminate the area again as the shadow vanished. He looked up and could no longer see the gigantic pitch-black sailboat. The wind and seas were calm, and the skies were clear. Why would he suddenly be here? Wasn't it said that he was still at the Fog Sea recently? Danitz frowned as he muttered to himself in puzzlement. That Dark Emperor can cruise through the spirit world, so it's very normal for it to come all the way from the Fog Sea in a span of a few days. This is also probably one of the reasons why Nast is the greatest of the 4 kings. Klein thought to himself. He believed that Nast was lured by the Dark Emperor card, but it was likely that Nast could only determine a vague area. Klein retracted his gaze and sat back down as though nothing had happened. The straight-line distance between Byam and Dylinius wasn't great, but a sufficiently safe sea route was filled with twists and turns, so it took the liner until sunset before it reached the dock. After that, Klein changed his appearance and used a fake identity to buy 2 early tickets and set off before it got dark. They arrived at Gargas at dawn. Danitz didn't enter the city and instead brought Klein on a detour to a private harbor. They then took a simple fishing boat and set off to sea. After nearly 2 hours, Klein saw a sailboat which was dozens of meters long. It was clean and produced a golden luster from the sunlight reflected on it. Compared to similar sailboats, it appeared extremely special. Along the central axis was the main cannon, which was stacked with symbols and patterns. Faint but pure light swirled around it. That's the cannon of purification. It can only be used 10 times before 6 priests of light are needed to hold a ritual. They will pray to the corresponding deity to fill it up with spirituality, Danitz introduced smugly. A gigantic version of a charm? After a certain period of time, it will likely automatically lose its spirituality. Backing Vice Admiral Iceberg is the Church of the Eternal Blazing Sun? Or one that can nurture priests of light? Kleins remained stoic as he mumbled inwardly. Back when he first saw the Golden Dream in Danitz's dream, he wasn't too surprised by the main canon. After all, dreams didn't need to adhere to logic. Perhaps Danitz had seen an ironclad warship and its main cannon had left a deep impression on him, causing him to reproduce it in his dream. To Klein's surprise, the Golden Dream really had something that required extremely copious amounts of knowledge and mysticism. It wasn't something an ordinary faction could produce. Soon, the Golden Dream dispatched a dinghy and quickly steered towards the fishing boat. Danitz spread his hands open before clenching them tightly. He then jumped down and landed in the dinghy without causing it to shake. He whistled and struck palms with the pirate who was steering. He found the former feeling of ruling over the ocean again. However, this excitement didn't last long as the dinghy behind him suddenly dipped a little. One more person had joined them. I forgot about that madman. Danitz wiped away his smile and sat down. Klein observed the pirates and pressed down his hat. He sat down calmly without a word. Before long, he landed on the deck of the Golden Dream and saw Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards standing in silence. This pirate admiral was nearly identical to how she looked when they met in the dream. There weren't any changes to her hair or looks. She now wore dark trousers with a pair of leather boots instead of wearing a dress. She also had a valiant bearing to her wisdom and beauty. She's more like a pirate this time than a teacher. Klein nodded gently and smiled politely. Good morning, ma'am, Captain. Good morning, Mr. Gehrman, Edwina replied with a smile. She turned around and walked to a spot where fishing nets were being hung out to dry. She signaled the pirates to walk away and get busy with their own work. Fishing nets. As expected of a pirate crew that's more like treasure hunters. This is in preparation to improve their meals? Klein followed in silence. Danitz very naturally found a few of his companions he was most familiar with to have drinks and to brag to. Of course, he didn't let down his guard. From time to time, he would glance over, afraid that his captain would end up exchanging blows with Gehrman Sparrow. He was ready to get his companions to join the brawl at any moment. This time, Klein didn't wait for Edwina to explain why she had invited him. After 2 seconds of silence, he asked, "What do you know of Tracy?" He planned on asking all his questions before listening to Edwina's motives. He wanted to prevent himself from being embarrassed to ask further after rejecting a request he couldn't agree to. Tracy. Edwina's eyes quivered a little. She's a demoness, a sequence 5 demoness of affliction. Demoness? Klein nearly lost it. He felt that his fate seemed to be intertwined with demonesses. First, it was witch Trissy, and then there was demoness of pleasure Madame Sharon, and then there was demoness of pleasure Trissy Cheek, and a high-ranking demoness he only heard the voice of. Now, there was another demoness of affliction, Tracy. Edwina didn't sense the upheavals he was going through and continued. She's different from the typical demoness. She has her own ideals and pursuits. She's quite an oddity in the demoness sect. However, she would still work for the organization doing work such as human trafficking or something else. Different from the typical demoness? She doesn't give up on herself and chooses to give pleasure to women? Klein suddenly thought of red-haired Helene. However, he couldn't be certain because not every demoness was the result of a man changing into a woman. There were real women who wished to become an assassin. After asking for the details, Klein deliberated and asked, "We met Nast and his Dark Emperor on the way here. In the recent months, matters involving you, Senor, Tracy, and Nast have happened in this area of the sea. This is rather abnormal. For out of the 4 kings and 7 admirals had involved themselves in the Rorsted Sea in a short span of time. This wasn't even including the recently recruited Tarot Club member, Admiral of Stars Catlia. In terms of probability, this was indeed quite abnormal. Of course, Klein had some theories, but he wished to see if Vice Admiral Iceberg was able to provide some fresh insight. Edwina listened without saying a word. She pulled the edge of a fishing net and held it in front of her. She took out a fountain pen, a brass dagger, metallic bottles, and other things from her pockets and the inner section of her belt and placed them on the spread-out net. They latched on firmly without moving. It didn't seem like there would be any interaction between them. At this moment, Edwina bent over and picked up a rock used to press down the net, and she placed it in the middle of the open net. The net immediately depressed, causing the surroundings to contract. The fountain pen, dagger, and bottles tumbled towards the center and gathered beside the rock. It's probably something like this. Some unknown existence has appeared in the net of fate and is pulling us towards it, Edwina explained simply. This is like an actual model of the law of convergence for Beyonder characteristics. Klein thought as he nodded. With regards to this, he was both enlightened but puzzled as well. He was enlightened because Edwina's explanation was nearly the same as his guess, but he was puzzled because it couldn't be used to analyze the problems. The King of the 5 Seas Nast appeared because of me. Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy can also be barely explained, since I did come into contact with Trissy Cheek. As for Vice Admiral Iceberg and Admiral of Blood, I can't find a reason. Perhaps it's purely a coincidence? Besides, it's the latter that attracted the former out. Klein retracted his gaze and asked about something else. Then he said, "Ma'am, Captain, is there a reason for inviting me here?" Edwina gave him a deep look and said, "Your identity indicates that you came from Backlund. According to what I know, this identity isn't authentic enough. There's no powerful bounty hunter named Gehrman Sparrow from there. The faction backing you is very powerful. Furthermore, it has quite an extensive network in Backlund. You managed to so quickly notice a problem with my identity." Klein didn't panic as he smiled calmly. "Everyone will have some secrets." Edwina remained silent for a few seconds without pressing the issue. She then said, "Not long before Calvetua died, you sacrificed something to it." Klein turned his head slightly and swept his gaze across Danitz, who was drinking beer. Alarmed, Danitz spewed the beer all over himself. Klein retracted his gaze and didn't deny or admit it as he looked at Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina. Edwina continued without a change in expression. After Calvetua died, the sea god is still replying to its believers. Chapter 576, Vice Admiral Iceberg's collector's room. Is she suspecting something? Klein looked straight into Edwina's eyes without moving them away. Nor did his eyes blink or dodge. After knowing that Danitz had divulged his sacrificial ritual to Calvetua before it died, Klein had the necessary preparations. If he wasn't standing on the shipboard and was instead sitting on a soda, then he definitely would have crossed his right leg and leaned back to give a calm and composed answer. He smiled as he raised his left hand. He introduced with a calm tone, "This glove of mine is called Creeping Hunger." Klein believed that Danitz, who had witnessed him in combat, had definitely passed the relevant details on to his captain. Therefore, with Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina being of equal rank as Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos, it wasn't difficult for her to guess that he had acquired Creeping Hunger. In that case, taking the initiative to divulge it gave him a psychological advantage rather than being exposed by her. And for him to suddenly mention it gave it a double meaning. First, he was hinting to her that he had an organization backing him, one that could kill Vice Admiral Hurricane and orchestrate Calvetua's death and reply to its believers in its stead. Second, it was a warning for Edwina that she was not to attempt to investigate or delve deeper into the matter. Otherwise, the instantaneous death of Vice Admiral Hurricane awaited her. At this moment in time, Klein continued maintaining Gehrman Sparrow's persona. He didn't directly threaten her or refuse to admit it. Instead, he provided a calm answer that hid madness within it. Edwina Edwards nodded slightly and suddenly changed topics. I plan on providing a certain amount of assistance to the resistance in the Rørsted archipelago, mainly in food and fabric. Assistance? Her backing faction is against loan, or it just wants to make things difficult for the Church of Storms? Klein wiped his smile and calmly replied, "This has nothing to do with me. Don't expect me to trip up," he said silently to himself. Edwina turned her head and raised her arm to point to blazing Danitz, who was drinking while secretly stealing glances. "I will entrust him to handle it, including contacting the resistance and confirming the time. We'll arrange for a private harbor, and I wish you can provide sufficient help." Danitz spewed out a golden waterfall from his mouth. Pa. Bam, bam, bam. The two pirates sitting beside him laughed as they bent their backs and struck the deck, spewing out the beer that they had just drunk. One of them had dark skin like he was covered in a layer of metal skin. His waist was rather thick, and although he wasn't fat, he had no curvature to speak of. Edwina retracted her gaze and added in an unhurried manner before Klein could speak, "You're an adventurer. I believe you won't decline a job that pays well." "You really have found me an excellent excuse." Klein smiled in response. "Of course." He didn't ask how much the payment was, while Edwina seemed to forget mentioning it. This intelligent and beautiful pirate admiral gloomily said, "Senor got someone to pass me the news that he's willing to buy the key of the giants, which I previously discovered, for 5,000 pounds. It was the item proclaimed to be Death's Key. It was a gigantic black iron key that nearly made Danitz lose his life in Byam. Klein suspected that it didn't originate from the Dark Second Epoch, but it was something that was connected to the Giant King's court. She's hinting at me to offer a price?" Klein was first taken aback before he came to a realization. He couldn't help but inwardly mumble, 5,000 pounds? I don't even know if the key is of any use, or if it really involves the Giant King's court. If it doesn't have anything to do with it, can I return it for a refund? Besides, there's no prior information about it. Even if I take it above the gray fog to divine it, I wouldn't receive any effective revelations. Yes, a simple inference is that if it doesn't involve the Giant King's court but some other treasure that I have no idea about, then it would be useless if I buy it. The only benefit is that it will disrupt Admiral of Blood's plans. It harms him without benefiting me. If it involves the Giant King's court, Admiral of Blood is unlikely to find the target location even if he bought it, as it's located in the forsaken land of the gods. Besides, I plan to hunt him. When the time comes, I can obtain the key without spending any money. It's equivalent to having him buy it for me and watch over it for some time. Although such thoughts are very idealistic, it's not impossible. Klein pondered for a few seconds and said, "It might be hiding a huge secret." He deliberately mentioned this to make Vice Admiral Iceberg unwilling to sell the gigantic black iron key to Admiral of Blood Senior. It was to prevent the latter from rapidly strengthening himself after obtaining the treasure and step into the demigod realm. That would bring a considerable calamity upon Klein. Edwina listened silently and didn't continue on the topic. She turned her body halfway around and pointed at the cabin's entrance. "Breakfast has been prepared for you." "Thank you." Klein took off his hat and bowed. As he followed Vice Admiral Iceberg into the cabin, he quickly recalled the conversation they just had and sought out the true motive behind Edwina's invitation. From Gairman Sparrow's identity problems, to the mystical item suspected to be creeping hunger, to the matter of the sacrifice to Calvetua while the Dead Sea God continued responding to believers, all of these matters put together does allow one to imagine that I have a secret organization backing me, one whose motives are unknown. As for the faction that Vice Admiral Iceberg belongs to, it's very wary, guarded, and interested in this matter. Therefore, it got her to probe me in person to see if they can obtain something. They're still rather friendly at the moment. Extending their assistance to the resistance is a way to convey their intentions. It seems they're leaning towards cooperating with the organization backing me. Of course, the unknown always leaves others afraid. Without grasping the situation, the chances of Vice Admiral Iceberg and company attacking me is very, very low. Haha, if they realize that the secret organization backing me was established only about half a year ago, including the world and Miss Sayo, whose connection has been established but not recruited. There aren't more than 10 people. I wonder if they will get so infuriated that they end up losing control. As his thoughts raced, Klein entered the cabin and followed a dim passageway, passing through one wooden door after another. He followed Edwina up some stairs and arrived at a brighter second level. Before entering the pirates' dining hall, they passed by a half-opened room. Klein casually glanced inside and saw a gigantic black iron key sitting on a wooden table. These items are evidence from our various treasure hunting expeditions. Most of them are mementos, while others have yet to show their value and require further study. Edwina appeared cold, but her explanations were in great detail. It had the feeling like she was afraid that he wouldn't understand her or was left puzzled. And when she mentioned the word study, her aqueous blue eyes clearly lit up a little. Evidence of the various treasure hunting expeditions? Klein couldn't help but look inside carefully. At this point, Edwina pushed open the door and walked in. She then introduced in passing, "This is a gold coin from the 4th epic Solomon Empire." Klein's gaze shifted over and saw a coin placed inside a frame. It was entirely dark gold in color, as though it was combined from two semicircles of different dimensions. It looked extremely asymmetrical, and there was a sharp crown engraved on its surface. It looked very similar to the crown worn on the King of the Five Seas, Nast. Edwina was like an owner who liked to flaunt her collection. She began introducing the items in the room, making Klein recall a familiar person, old Mr. Eye of Wisdom, the great detective, Isengard Stanton. In regards to the trait of flaunting collections, they're very similar. Is this a tendency of people with huge collections? Wait, Mr. Stanton had studied in Lemberg for 4 years. Vice Admiral Iceberg's description includes information that Edwina Edwards that hails from Lemberg. Lemberg's capital is the headquarters of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Mr. Stanton also admitted that he converted his faith to the God of Knowledge and Wisdom while studying abroad. Could the faction backing Vice Admiral Iceberg be them? Klein listened in thought until Edwina stopped in front of the huge iron black key. Just like he had seen in the dream, the key was about the size of a 7-string zither. An ordinary human would have to wrap their arms around it to move it. It was dull and ancient-looking. The patterns on it are similar to the City of Silver style. It clearly has giant traits. Klein nodded and was just about to retract his gaze when he heard Edwina say, "You can study it." "You are letting me study it? You probably have no idea how many latent problems I've triggered in the past. Aren't you afraid that the golden dream will disappear once you let me study it?" Klein criticized himself in a self-deprecatory manner before reaching out his right hand to touch the black iron key that seemed to belong to a giant's. He found it ice-cold to the touch, and regardless of how much spirituality he injected into it, it was useless. "Unfortunately, I cannot bring it above the gray fog to study it." Klein retracted his right hand and shook his head indiscernibly. He shifted his gaze onto a book in goatskin placed on the same table. On the brown cover were words written in ancient Faesac, "Grozel's Travels." It originates from a sunken ship. It had been soaked at the bottom of the sea for 165 years without suffering any damage, Edwina introduced. It records a story about a giant named Grozel. He had decided to head to the nation of Frost to hunt the King of the North, a powerful frost dragon. Along the way, he encounters companions, a female elf, a devout ascetic, an aristocrat of the Solomon Empire, and a lone soldier. The story develops until they encounter the King of the North before it suddenly comes to a halt. It's not the end, but the later pages cannot be opened no matter what methods are used. You can give it a try. This isn't a notebook in a journal style, but rather a novel? This novel sure is odd. It puts together characters from different epochs and eras. It should be something that was recently produced. Klein flipped through the book and allowed the yellowish-brown pages to slide past one after another. The content was roughly what Edwina said, but the story appeared rather abrupt and fractured. It kept making Klein suspect if he had missed a paragraph. For example, the protagonists would become familiar with one another moments after encountering each other as strangers. Soon, he browsed to the last few pages and found that they were stuck together. There was no way he could pry them apart. Such effects probably can be dealt with above the gray fog. I wonder what sort of accidents might happen. Klein turned his head to look at Vice Admiral Iceberg. Edwina fell silent for a moment before saying, "If you wish to have it, I can sell it to you. I've studied it for years without gleaning anything from it. However, I have a condition." "What is it?" Klein returned with a question. Edwina pursed her lips and said, "If you figure out something, you have to tell me the result, so that I won't have to be puzzled over it. As long as you agree to this condition, I can sell it to you for cheap." Klein's interest was suddenly piqued. "How much?" £8,000, Edwina said calmly. Klein deliberately pondered as he nodded indifferently. "I'll consider it. I'll consider how to pretend that this never happened," he thought silently to himself. Chapter 577. Book from more than 3,000 years ago. Vice Admiral Iceberg. Edwina didn't show any changes in her expression when she heard Gehrman Sparrow say that he needed to consider it. She nodded calmly. "No hurry. She seems to feel that I'm unable to make the decision regarding a transaction of this scale and that I need to seek advice from the secret organization backing me. Is this a problem of me not being able to make the decision? This is a problem of not having the money." Klein lampooned and closed Grozel's travels. He asked in a deep voice, "Do you know who the author is? What happened to the people who last possessed this book?" Edwina walked in front of him and reached out her right hand. She rubbed the cover with her fingertip and said, "The owners from before cannot be identified, as the sinking of the ship has resulted in the relevant information being lost to history. Similarly, we are unable to confirm who the author is." "Oh, the book doesn't include the author's name. I've used some mystical arts to study it and discovered that the goatskin was created at least 3,000 years ago, before the cataclysm. This is why I believe it's worth at least £8,000. A book from 3,000 years ago. There's a dragon, an elf, and a human ascetic, a Solomon Empire noble, and a lone soldier. These are all concepts from years later. A magical book that contains the power of prophecy? Or did someone specially use an ancient goatskin to create it? But it's meaningless to do so. It's purely a hoax?" Klein deliberately curled the corners of his mouth without any intent of smiling. "The giant's name is Grozel. Could the author be Roselle?" "No, Roselle's name originated from a root word in Jotun. When ancient Fasak evolved into Intis, there was a second change, making it have a different meaning." Edwina explained in detail the origins of Roselle's name. It left Klein stunned as he felt like he was back in school. He nodded gently and said in an unperturbed tone, "If it's an ancient piece of work, I'm very curious as to why a frost dragon would be named the King of the North. What sequence and pathway does it correspond to?" Edwina raised her gaze from Grozel's travels and looked at Klein. Before the appearance of the first blasphemy slate, there was no concept of sequences and pathways. Furthermore, many creatures didn't abide by such arrangements. In that epoch, chaos and mania was the basic attitude to everything. Some dragons might gather many Beyonder characteristics related to frost, just like a demonist's frost, a zombie's frost, and a weather warlock's frost. As such, it would possess rather powerful strength and a relatively high level. Of course, such a gathering would definitely lead to death and a loss of control. This means that if it doesn't die, it would definitely lose control and become a monster. However, a dragon is a monster in and of itself. If there are many similar products of this sort from the dragons, giants, and elves, then it can be understood why the second epoch is known as the Dark Epoch. Klein pondered for a moment and inquired as though he was talking to himself, "This results in the wastage of Beyonder characteristics." Edwina looked at him for a few seconds. Emperor Roselle once said this, "Whatever separates will definitely converge, and whatever converges will definitely separate." The emperor said that before? I understand the first part. That's another form of saying the law of convergence of Beyonder characteristics. But what does the second part mean? After the convergence happens to a certain extent, it would tend to separate and dissociate? When one doesn't belong to a particular pathway, the extremely chaotic convergent mix will cause a dissociation. The more chaotic it is, the more repulsion there is between the characteristics? Such words aren't likely to be said to anyone. It definitely isn't something that's spread out in the public. Last time, I guessed from the Vice Admiral's usage of the Roselle's dream spell and her last name that she's a descendant of one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, Edwards. It's extremely possible. After the Emperor perished, their family escaped to Lemberg and gradually converted their faith to the god of knowledge and wisdom. What a good teacher. She answers any question. Klein didn't speak further as he continued admiring Vice Admiral Iceberg's collection. At the same time, he had some thoughts. He planned on asking Little Son via the world during the tarot gathering if he knew of the book, Groselle's Travels. Of course, in order to prevent the hanged man from sensing something problematic with the world and hence, figure out that something was amiss with the fool, he decided to communicate in private while blocking everyone else. After a brief excursion of the room, Edwina led Klein out and entered the captain's room in the dining hall. The relatively special food here is yogurt. You can add strawberry jam and other things. You can also directly add honey. Edwina pointed to the row of food outside. There's some dried fish that isn't bad. They come from the deep sea, species that have yet to be named. As she spoke, she gestured for Klein to take the food for himself to bring back to the room. She then got up and made herself an example. Klein took some yogurt of unknown origins and added a few spoonfuls of honey. Then he carried his tray and placed pork sausages, buttered bread, and other food on it. During this process, he saw a young man dressed in a white shirt and black vest, decked out with a flowery bow tie, looking more like an office worker than a pirate, approach Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina and have a hushed exchange with her. The man had pretty good looks with almost blonde hair other than his slightly black hair roots. His hair was neatly combed to the sides. His eyes were a very light lake green color, and his nose was sharp. He had thin lips and that made him exude a trustworthy vibe. Don't be fooled by that guy's appearance. He's a wolffish can. He stinks deep down. Danitz whispered in contempt, having entered the pirates' dining hall and arriving beside Klein at some point in time. Klein turned his head and glanced at him without saying a word. This was because he knew Danitz would offer to explain without him egging him on. Without waiting for Danitz to speak, a man with a swollen waist beside him said with a crude and sharp voice, "He's the 3rd mate, Jodson. He used to be a Casanova and part-time pirate, saying that he would steal our captain's heart, but he ended up getting a beating. He ended up staying to be educated. Dogs it. In short, he's a bad egg." Danitz emphasized. "He's a bad egg," another pirated with iron-black skin echoed. "Why do I have the nagging feeling that all of you are the same?" Klein thought and said, "Flowery bow tie Jodson with a bounty of 5,200 pounds? Sequence 6? As expected of the standard Gehrman Sparrow reaction. Danitz glanced to the side as a lingering sense of fear was hidden within his contempt. "He's not that strong, but he's very strange. In my brawls with him, no, when in combat, fireballs suddenly can't be used, and he will be able to replicate my fire powers." A very familiar description. Klein subconsciously glanced towards Jodson. After some careful thought, he recalled the familiarity. This is very similar to the sealed artifact, Blood Vessel Thief, found behind Tingen City's Chinese Gate. Klein had already forgotten the Blood Vessel Thief's sealed artifact number, but he still remembered clearly that it could temporarily steal a person's beyonder powers for themselves. The corresponding pathway? Klein retracted his gaze and discovered that Danitz and his 2 companions were drinking while looking in that direction. Thinking back to how Danitz divulged his sacrifice to Calvetua, Klein took a cup of beer and carried his food tray towards the captain's dining room. He said indifferently, "All of you like her, right?" Behind Klein, there was the sound of alcohol being spewed out at the same time. He saw Danitz jump backward through the corner of his eye, looking at him in horror before turning his head in relief to size up his companions. They had unknowingly opened up a gap between themselves as the look in their eyes turned complicated. They looked like they had the fury of being fooled. Klein didn't stop. He returned to the captain's dining room and enjoyed breakfast. After a while, Edwina carried a meal tray back. She drank a mouthful of milk and paused before saying, "Danitz showed me the summoning ritual of your messenger. It mentions that 1 gold coin is a necessary component. I'm somewhat perplexed. Does it refer to lone gold coins, or those from Intis, Fasak, or somewhere else? Their weights are all different, and the amount of gold they contain is different. Klein thought for a moment before saying, Lone's gold coin. This is also the gold coin that's worth the most. It's not like I need to pay for it myself. Klein added inwardly. Edwina nodded. Payment also needs to be done when receiving a reply? Different spirit world creatures have different hobbies, Klein said. He knew that Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina was a researcher of spirit world creatures, and he believed that she could understand what he meant. Furthermore, he wasn't lying. He just hid the fact that the messenger's owner could also pay for it. Yes, Edwina very seriously answered him. I once attempted to find a messenger, but I could only use trial and error for the incantation. Not only was it dangerous, but it was very difficult to satisfy the requirements. I eventually had to give up. This is one of the reasons. The other reason is that simulating the power of the undead isn't enough to sign the contract. Your incantation has given me quite the inspiration. Klein ate his breakfast in silence without explaining anything. This was because this was the knowledge he had learned from Mr. Azek. He wasn't at liberty to teach it to others without receiving permission from him. After a delicious and quiet breakfast, the Golden Dream approached a private harbor and dropped Klein and Danitz off. Danitz looked back at the glimmering golden ship and suddenly sighed. I feel like my friendship has sunk into the ocean. Klein pressed down on his hat and calmly said, Losers can always form alliances among themselves. Danitz was unsure whether he should be happy or sad. After changing their identities and creating fake identification, they successfully bought tickets back to Byam and boarded the ship. Klein finally had a private space for himself. He entered the washroom and went above the gray fog and began scanning through the believer's prayers. This time, the first thing that appeared before him was the bald member of the resistance, Kalat. Honorable God, we have discovered the whereabouts of red-haired Helene. She's currently hiding in the Intis embassy. This has been confirmed by a laundry maid and gardener. Chapter 578. Abduction, in the Intis embassy of the City of Generosity, Byam. Helene sat in front of a dresser, looking at her beautiful yet somewhat frail reflection. She sat there in a daze for several minutes. Her escape from the Black Death had been filled with anticipation and torment. She was afraid that any tiny mishap would cause her to be discovered by pirates or adventurers, causing her to be caught by Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy once again and making her lose all her freedom. She would then never be able to return to her hometown and return to the life she originally enjoyed. Only when she used the meager connections left by her family did she manage to hide inside her country's embassy and obtain a ticket to leave the sea, providing her a little relief. However, this still wasn't enough to make her feel at ease. She believed that everything would only be truly over when she stepped onto the northern continent. With this in mind, Helene couldn't help but raise her right hand and touch her cheeks, which weren't considered fair but was sufficiently healthy. She realized that her exquisiteness had improved significantly since her time as a sea merchant. She felt like time had reversed, making her mistake herself as returning to her days as a young lady. In fact, after entering the Intis embassy, she had an additional choice other than escaping the sea: cooperate with the Church of Storms, Loan's military, or the embassy. By using herself as bait, they could capture Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. But after considerable thought, she finally gave up on this plan. She even begged her family elder, who was an officer in the embassy, to keep the information of her hiding in there from others. Regardless, she ultimately didn't cause me any actual harm. Many a time, she indulged and satisfied me. Apart from every night. But that's only on the surface. Amid her recollections, Helene quickly blushed red. Those intoxicating nights, the fiery passion from having limbs intertwined with each other, and the unimaginable pleasure flashed past her mind, leaving her unable to compose herself. Helene slowly took a deep breath before exhaling. She shook her head and made her pining for freedom, her homeland, and her family occupy her heart again. She once again looked at her reflection and coiled up her drooping red hair. Then, she thickened her eyebrows with makeup and darkened the contours, making her facial features sharper and pronounced. After this round of makeup, Helene looked more androgynous, with a masculine air to her. Finally, she took off her clothes and used a cloth to flatten her chest. She then wore a white shirt, a black vest, men's trousers, and a double-breasted frock coat. Finally, she took a silk hat and wore it on her head, hiding the coiled red hair inside. At this moment, her reflection appeared more like a handsome young man than a lady. Her emerald-like eyes specifically seemed to suit her getup, giving her an alluring level of profundity. Helene patiently waited until someone knocked on her door. She picked up her luggage and walked out the door. She followed the good friend of her senior family member all the way to the side door in the embassy's garden. A carriage was there waiting for her. It was to send her to the harbor where she would board a liner and head for the Lone Kingdom's Pritz Harbor. There, she would make a detour to return to Intis. Helene had anti-tracking beyond her powers. She carefully observed the surroundings, including the carriage driver. A thin and virile local. Doesn't like wearing hats. His looks are identical to the one I met before. He looks a little nervous, but that's normal. After Helene did her final checks, she thanked her family senior's friend, carried her luggage, and boarded the carriage. As the wheels started to roll, she pursed her lips and looked out the window, watching one Intis parasol tree after another being quickly left behind. This gave her an inexplicable feeling as though she was back in Trier. It was a huge city filled with sunshine, located in the region of the Rhine River and Srenzo River. It was a radiant and enchanting scene with all sorts of roses. It was a place with bustling arts and humanities, a sacred land for artists, musicians, and novelists. That was Intis's capital. After Emperor Roselle rebuilt it, it was in the true sense of the word, a world-class metropolis. It was also Helene's hometown. She grew up there and often cried when she saw it in her dreams. After an unknown period of time, Helene suddenly felt something was amiss. The surrounding streets were turning more deserted and remote. As a sea merchant, although she spent most of her time in the Fog Sea and wasn't too familiar with biome in the Sonia Sea, being a Sequence 9 hunter made her sufficiently alert. Is this route correct? Helene moved from her seat and carefully asked the carriage driver. She was prepared to jump off the carriage and produce a fireball at any moment. The carriage driver didn't look back as he continued looking forward. He said with a sycophant smile, "Honorable lady, this route is closer, and it's not that easy to get into jams. As you know, Biome was built years ago. Back then, there weren't that many people or carriages. Many streets are narrow. Around noon and in the evening, it's very easy to encounter jams. Walking would be even faster than taking a carriage." Is that so? Helene thought about it and believed his explanation. This was because she had encountered such situations in several cities. Trier is still the best. When Emperor Roselle reformed the old city districts, he had the foresight to widen the roads. There's sufficient space even today. Helene had this thought flash through her mind when she heard the horse pulling the carriage neigh, seemingly in pain. Wait a moment. It seems to have stepped on something. The carriage driver stopped the carriage to the side and jumped off. Helene originally didn't think much of it, but sweeping the area with the corner of her eye, she realized that they were in an uninhabited quiet alley. Her heartstrings tightened as she didn't hesitate to attempt breaking through the carriage walls and escape. Regardless of whether it was an overreaction or not, she believed that it was necessary. At that moment, an intense horror surged out from the bottom of her heart. It felt like she had been locked onto by an extremely hungry monster. The pressure she felt at a spiritual level left her hesitant. She didn't dare to rashly take action. Following that, she heard a deep voice. "I won't harm you. I have some questions for you." Helene's mind raced as she quickly considered the options placed before her. Ultimately, she didn't rashly escape. She sat back in her spot under the tremendously terrifying pressure. She planned on assessing the situation first before adjusting her plans. The door to the carriage opened, and the thin and virile local carriage driver walked in. He sat opposite Helene, and he was none other than Faceless Klein. In order to act as the carriage driver, he had specifically practiced how to drive a horse and carriage. This was a technique he had failed to properly learn while he was on the Tinjin City's Nighthawk squad. Due to the little amount of time he didn't master it sufficiently and could only use Creeping Hunger's aura to successfully make the horse obedient. At the same time, Danitz, who was hidden nearby, quickly ran over and took the carriage driver's seat and began driving the carriage. His round felt hat was pressed low, and he was dressed like a real carriage driver. Helene bent her back in a guarded manner, like a leopard who was ready to pounce at any time. She felt that the gaze of the man opposite her was sweeping through her forehead, her eyebrows, her eyes, nose, mouth, neck, chest, waist, and legs. It left her extremely uneasy. She had encountered such gazes and methods of sizing her up back in Intis, in Trier, and during the days when she was out at sea. It was something that disgusting perverts filled with sexual desires possessed. But this time, she strangely didn't feel insulted. She didn't have the feeling that the man would rip off her clothes or was fantasizing about something abnormal. Instead, he looks like he's studying food. He's like an icy cold snake that's slithering across my skin. Helene finally couldn't bear it as she asked, "What questions do you have?" After fully grasping her looks and features, Klein leaned forward and placed his arms on his thighs in a natural manner. He slightly clasped his palms and said, "Have you heard of a person named Jimmy Necker?" Helene took a few seconds to recall before firmly shaking her head. She slightly frowned and asked in a daze, "Have you gotten the wrong person? He's a tycoon, someone who likes to collect things." "Have you heard of such a person from Tracy?" Klein asked again. Helene sighed secretly and replied seriously, "No. She never mentioned a tycoon who likes collecting." Klein looked at the red-haired lady's eyes and said with an unhurried tone, "Then, does her room have any ancient documents regarding the southern continent's Balam Empire?" "No. She's not someone who enjoys reading documents. She hates reading. She even gets me to read novels to her." With that said, Helene revealed a bitter smile. "What novels does she read?" Klein asked without a change in tone. "Those classics by Roselle, as well as any contemporary romance stories," Helene answered frankly. Klein nodded. "Does she have a collector's room?" "Yes, but apart from her and a few mysterious visitors, no one is allowed entry, including me," Helene said as she recalled. Klein fell silent for a few seconds as he maintained an unchanging posture. "Tell me your story." "Mine?" Helene pointed at herself in surprise. Klein nodded gently without repeating himself. Helene said after momentarily being dazed, "My story is very simple. My father is a member of the former Sauron royal family of Intis. He received quite a bit of wealth, but he lost himself to alcohol, mistresses, marijuana, and gambling, causing him to eventually go bankrupt. In order to repay the debts, I chose to accept some conditions raised by the family and became a beyonder. I then went out to sea to become a sea merchant." Chapter 579. Academic question. As she spoke, Helene's eyes moved up slightly as though she was immersed in her memories. "Early on, I transported iron and coal from mid-seashore to Fainapotter, then I shipped back tobacco, coffee, cocoa, and other native specialties back to Intis. This is a sea route that borders the shore, so it was rather safe. The competition was intense as well. In order to quickly get out of my predicament and save up money, I worked hard to raise my sequence, hoping that I could trade in the colonies. Unfortunately, just as I familiarized myself with the sea route and made some money, I chanced upon Ailment Maiden Tracy, who wasn't Vice Admiral Ailment at the time, in one of her raids during my second trip to West Balam. She only had one ship back then, but she was very powerful. My partner and I resisted with our lives, but all of that was in vain. She doesn't have the habit of killing mindlessly. All she did was snatch the goods as well as myself, as expected of an oddity among demonesses." Klein listened in silence and used his clown powers to suppress his embarrassed emotions to expressionlessly ask, "How far did the relationship between the two of you go?" "We didn't." Helene instinctively denied. "She forced me. I didn't want to die. I could only choose to accept it. Besides, she's a woman." "Lady, there's no need to get so worked up. If I had asked if the two of you had a relationship that went beyond friendship, Would you have jumped out? It's only because I'm kind enough and had considered your shame which had prevented me from being so direct. Under the facade of the crazy Gairman Sparrow is a gentlemanly me. That's the true me. Klein switched to asking without a change in expression, what kind of food do you like? Are there any dishes you especially like? Do you prefer sweet or salty food, or somewhere in between? What food do you dislike? What food are you allergic to? Do you have any dietary restrictions? If you do, what are they? These questions made Helene feel like she was in a dream, as though everything was surreal. She never imagined that the man would ask her such questions. It was like a pursuer was asking his crush what hobbies she had. No pursuer would ask such questions. These are all indirectly obtained from numerous chats, or are obtained by other means. No woman would like to be questioned like that. This is like a survey which Emperor Roselle created. What does he want? He's asking these questions without any expression. I'm so afraid. Helene fell silent for a few seconds before answering them one after another under Klein's cold, unmoving gaze. Klein maintained his seating posture of leaning forward and continued asking, how do you usually sit? Do you have any habitual motions? The more Helene answered, the more panicked she became. She had the inexplicable feeling that answering these questions would make her disappear. By the time the perplexing and terrifying survey was done, she felt heavy deep down, constantly suspecting that a terrible outcome awaited her. Why don't I risk it and jump off the carriage while he isn't paying attention? Helene seriously considered the possibility. However, the man didn't seem to have any indication of attacking her, and this made her indecisive. She felt that there was hope to resolve the matter amicably. After grasping Helene's personality, habits, and preferences, Klein turned the topic towards Vice Admiral Ailment. What do you know of Tracy? Helene fell silent as her mouth quivered a few times. She couldn't bring herself to speak. After the carriage continued on for quite a while, it was only then that she finally smiled ruefully. She possesses excellent combat abilities. She's good at infiltration and curses, with her being capable of turning invisible and becoming light. She grasps the means of swapping bodies with a mirror or magic staff, as well as black flames and frost. She can make enemies in a certain range suddenly fall sick, including colds, pneumonia, gastroenteritis, and other illnesses. The longer the fight lasts with her, the worse the ailments inflicted. Some Beyonders might even directly die from a heart attack. She can also create invisible threads to control her enemy. She knows human anatomy very well. She can easily give people pleasure through contact. Is that kind of pleasure? She has an active charming ability that would make many pirates give up putting up a resistance once they're near her. She's often friendly, but she's cruel to her enemies. She enjoys destroying the perfection that others would wish to protect, making them suffer immense pain and torment. Helene didn't go into detail on how Tracy destroyed the state of perfection of others. There were many cruel stories and hilarious matters. This ailment maiden had once made her enemies, a father and son duo, kill each other, as well as instigate an enemy's wife to betray him and let him come across the scene. As expected of a demoness. She's a sequence 5 demoness who's one sequence higher than demoness of pleasure. Klein gained a basic grasp of Tracy's combat style, and he calmly asked again, does she have any mystical items? A bangle that's inlaid with diamonds. As long as she wears it, it's very difficult for Tracy to be injured. Helene hesitated before revealing Vice Admiral Ailment's secret. Klein asked a few other detailed questions as he straightened his body a little. Tracy is helping the demoness sect perform human trafficking? This was something he took great notice of when he heard Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina mention it. The demoness sect cooperated with Insanguil, and it was related to the royal family. It involved an underground ruin whose location was unknown. Tracy helped them in the human trafficking. Balin, who was pointed out by the hanged man, was someone who orchestrated numerous disappearance cases of slaves and the disappearance of primitive tribes in the southern continent. With him appearing at the underground ruins, he would be a member of the upper echelons. The biggest human trafficker, Capim, had Beyonders who were of the Arbiter pathway protecting him. And this is a pathway controlled by the Lone and Fena Potter royal families, as well as their military. All of these matters that Klein was aware of linked together to form a line, but he wasn't sure what it actually exposed. Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy was a breakthrough point. What demonist sect? Helene asked in puzzlement. You don't have to know, Klein calmly replied. If you don't know what a demonist is and end up suspecting that the extremely charming Vice Admiral Ailment who gives you pleasure is a dirty and savage man, then I'm afraid that you would have lost control on the spot. You don't have to thank me. I'm a good person, Klein lampooned inwardly. Helene suppressed her puzzlement and said while recalling, in recent years, she's been busy shipping slaves. The other end of the trade is crazy Captain Connors Victor. Rumor has it that he and many human traffickers and slave merchants in Lone have a deep partnership. Crazy Captain Connors Victor? Klein remembered the nickname and name. He nodded and no longer spoke in a heavy voice. Instead, he said in a relatively gentle voice, Did you involve yourself in such matters? Such as being a part-time pirate? This very polite and amiable tone left Danitz trembling for some baffling reason. He felt that Gehrman Sparrow being in such a state was much more terrifying than his cold and expressionless state. No. Helene shook her head. The blood of the Sauron family flows in me. I will not bring shame to my family. Besides, Tracy always said that she wouldn't let me be tainted by bloodshed and darkness. All of that would be faced by her. She must have read too many romance novels. Klein took out a gold coin and allowed it to weave between his fingers like it was dancing. He didn't keep it from Helene as he performed a divination in front of her to confirm that she wasn't lying. The result was that she was rather honest. This is also because I didn't ask in detail about her emotional entanglements with Tracy, otherwise, she wouldn't be that honest. Klein secretly reflected and put away the gold coin. At that moment in time, the carriage had circled around the harbor, no longer heading for the ship that Helene was meant to board. Klein looked at the scenery outside the window and took out a small metal bottle. He handed it to Helene and said, Use the liquid inside to wipe away your makeup. Why? Helene subconsciously asked. This isn't something you should be asking. Klein leaned forward once again and said without expression. Despite feeling aggrieved and furious, Helene didn't wish to agitate the man and get on his bad side at such a critical moment. She could only remove the bottle cap and took a sniff at it to test if it was poisonous. Can it be used directly? She asked. Klein tersely acknowledged in the affirmative. Helene took out a white handkerchief and dabbed it with the bottle's liquid. Then she began wiping her face and quickly cleaned away her prior disguise. Her aesthetically pleasing masculinity vanished and her contours became softer as Helene's original looks were presented before Klein. After careful observation, Klein calmly said, Take off your hat and let down your hair. Helene furrowed her brows and had a nagging feeling that what followed would be unacceptable instructions such as taking off her clothes. She took a deep breath, removed her hat, and released her coiled red hair. Immediately, she appeared extremely feminine. Klein straightened his body and leaned back on the carriage wall before calmly instructing, You can put on your disguise again. Is he a madman? After all this, he wants me to revert to how I was before? Helene didn't dare to voice her displeasure, afraid that the man would raise unacceptable requests. She hurriedly opened her suitcase and took out a mirror to look at herself. The makeup has been removed so cleanly. She was stunned for a moment before she quickly put on makeup and coiled her hair. When the carriage came to a stop, she was already looking like a handsome young man. Klein nodded indiscernibly and looked out the window before retracting his gaze. One last question. What? Helene asked nervously. Klein raised his line of sight a little as his facial muscles moved. How big are your breasts? Helene was first taken aback before her face flushed red. This wasn't a redness caused by embarrassment, but an anger from wanting to punch the man in the chin. Klein didn't move his gaze as he calmly added, It's an academic question. Noticing no sexual intent from his eyes, Helene inhaled and closed her eyes to answer the question. Klein secretly heaved a sigh of relief and took out a boat ticket and a stack of papers. New identification, tickets to Tiana Port. Once you're there, buy tickets to Pritz Harbor. Helene glanced at him vigilantly before receiving the tickets and documents. She carried her suitcase and carefully alighted the carriage to see the ship she was taking. Klein followed behind her and watched her leave. From the corner of his eye, he saw Danitz trying hard to hold back his laughter. Chapter 580. Worm-tongue Klein slowly turned his head and shot a glance at Danitz. The pirate with a bounty of 5,500 pounds immediately shut his mouth and clamped up. It was as though nothing had happened. After confirming that Helene boarded the liner without issues, he turned around and walked to the side of the carriage. He pretended to casually ask, "Did you hear the conversation?" No. A little, just a little." Danitz shook his head as he gave a hollow chuckle. Klein nodded slightly and said, "You have to remember, otherwise it'll be easy for people to see through you." "See through me?" Danitz raised his hand and pointed at his nose and said blankly. Klein said without changing his expression, "She's from the Sauron family. She has anti-tracking beyond her abilities. Together with her tics and behavior, it can be confirmed that she's a Sequence 7 from the Hunter pathway, Pyromaniac. She's very similar to you, and you'll be able to do a good job acting as her." "Me? I won't be able to disguise myself like her. I'll be identified with just a look." Danitz jumped in fright. Klein held back his laughter and said in a deep voice, "I'll lend you creeping hunger." "Oh no. I have no experience in such matters. I won't be able to fool Vice Admiral Ailman's subordinates." Abnormally nervous and horrified, Danitz declined the mission. To him, this was an extremely embarrassing and dog's-hit matter. Only a pervert or a madman would complete it without any qualms. Klein nodded in agreement and said without an expression, "Indeed, you are rather stupid." Danitz forced a smile. "Yes, I'm very stupid." Klein didn't say a word as he walked past Danitz and opened the door to the carriage. Danitz followed him with his eyes when he suddenly saw Gehrman Sparrow's hair turn red. He blinked his dull eyes and saw the man's facial contours turn soft and his eyes turning emerald green. His lips turned thin as they pursed, making him look frail and insecure. He had a masculine beauty and looked identical to Helene, who had just left. After watching Gehrman Sparrow enter the carriage, Danitz turned his head back as the corners of his mouth twitched. He was silent for a few seconds before he muttered silently, "What a madman." He changed into a woman without any hesitation. "I have to say that Helene looks pretty good when disguised as a man. This beyond her power sure is useful. If I can receive an item like that and figure out what Captain's ideal type is, then I can make the corresponding changes and make her fall in love with me. But in that case, would the person that she falls in love with still be me?" Danitz found himself pondering over philosophical questions until he heard a cough from the carriage behind him. He snapped to his senses and drove the carriage away from the harbor. He planned on making a huge detour before circling back. Inside the carriage, Klein wasn't as calm as he appeared. Although Helene was in male clothes, allowing him to temporarily not bother about the most embarrassing parts, he still felt quite embarrassed to have his face change into a woman's while squeezing out breasts. This left him feeling down and awkward. Sigh, a faceless change in appearance is very easy. The difficult part is apparently the mind. To act as a good faceless, I'll have to cross many mental blocks. If I don't, then I'll have to spend a great deal of time to act as a real person for many years. My identity has to be recognized by everyone as I fully immerse myself into that character until I almost treat it like it's real. This is more challenging on my bottom line. It's crazy and warped. To speed up my progress, I have to overcome a certain number of obstacles. Klein pulled out a suitcase from under the carriage's seat. He rummaged for some cloth and clothes before replicating Helene's disguise. He could have gotten Danitz to act as Helene and borrow the mystical item with the faceless beyonder characteristic from Justice for a few days without a problem. However, that meant that there was a high chance of Danitz facing Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy directly. Without the clown's powers, it was almost impossible for him to hide it from her, putting his life in extreme danger. It was impossible for Klein to make others bear such huge risks for his own matters. Therefore, he could only challenge himself and do it himself. Soon, he looked identical to Helene. Under the black top hat was a handsome androgynous face with soft and pronounced contours. His emerald green eyes looked as beautiful as gems. He adjusted his build, making himself shorter by a few centimeters and narrowing his shoulder width. His frame shrank and he looked like he had lightened significantly. His current appearance quickly surfaced in Klein's mind with his clown powers. It's still not bad. There's not much to it. Perhaps it's because I'm not in female clothes, so it doesn't feel much different from turning into Gehrman Sparrow, Danitz, or someone else. I just look prettier and have some discomfort in my chest. If I look like that on Earth, I wouldn't have needed to worry about not having a girlfriend, he mocked and consoled himself as he curled the corners of his mouth. What looked like a normal action on Gehrman Sparrow now looked pitiful and sorry. Klein cursed silently as he quickly adjusted his state of mind. Bit by bit, he immersed himself into the state of true acting. With the passage of time, he discovered that the resistance he had lessened significantly. Following that, he felt relaxed and calm as though the potion had harmonized itself further. And that meant that the speed of his digestion would speed up. Really is useful, Klein said silently as he got up and took 4 steps counterclockwise. He went above the gray fog and once again confirmed the danger level of his upcoming operation. After returning to the real world, he switched to using Helene's voice and deliberately suppressed it. Head to Pier 6 at the harbor. Danitz didn't find anything amiss, but he suddenly came to a realization after changing directions. He couldn't help but tremble. It's like the real person. I wouldn't be able to distinguish him if the day comes where he transforms into Captain to fool me. After a while, the carriage re-entered the harbor and went to the liner which Helene was originally meant to board. But it didn't truly approach it and had instead circled around to a nearby warehouse. Danitz jumped off the carriage and knocked on the warehouse's door, according to a prior agreed pattern. Out came a group of dock workers who were clearly of native blood. Following that, they made way. After confirming that there wasn't anything amiss, the bald member of the resistance, Kalat, came out on a wheelchair. Where is she? He looked at Danitz as he asked. Through Helene's matter, Danitz had successfully established communications with the resistance. Danitz laughed mischievously. In the carriage. She's been drugged with medicine that makes her lose her strength. Its effects will last another 10 hours. Remember, I want 70% of the 1,000-pound reward. Kalat raised his right arm and waved it. Immediately 2 thin members of the resistance got onto the carriage. Boss, it's that woman. They soon poked their heads out and said in the tone of a local gang. Take her down. Our mission is to protect her, Kalat emphasized again. Helene, who was disguised as a male, was helped down from the carriage with 2 soldiers supporting her on either side of her with his control as a clown. Klein pretended to be weak in the knees as he staggered. He was soon moved to a room among the Byam populace. At the same time, Kalat instructed a local gang member, who believed in Sea God, to find strongman Ozil and tell him that they had found the target. He was to bring 1,000 pounds in exchange for the woman. As for Danitz, he had returned to the inn to await the news. At noon, Ozil replied saying that he couldn't be sure if the person was the real deal and had planned on sending a person over to confirm things. Kalat agreed to his request. Closer to the evening, a figure appeared outside the house. He was a man wearing pantaloons and a jacket. He was Loanese and was dressed in the style of a native. He had short brows, about half of the average person's. His brown eyes were recessed and his face looked cut. Kalat pushed himself on a wheelchair and appeared by the door. After seeing the man, he said in a heavy voice, Mithur King, should I be honored that you actually know me? The man laughed. He was originally a captain of one of the pirate ships under Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos. After Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy took over the crew, he took on the role as third mate of her flagship, the Black Death. His nickname was Wormtongue, with a bounty of 5,400 pounds. Kalat didn't reply as he wheeled himself to make way. Mithur entered a nearby room after being led by a gang member. Inside, he saw Helene sitting by the bedside in a gentleman's outfit. Her eyes were darting about and glaring at him. Her teeth bit down on her lip as she looked furious and fearful while having feelings of despair and obstinacy. It's her all right. However, I can't be certain because she's wearing thick makeup. It's hard to tell what a woman really looks like once they don thick makeup. Wipe her face clean for me. Hey, why didn't you cuff her? Don't you know she's dangerous? Mithra surveyed the area and took 2 steps back in a guarded manner. She's been drugged. She doesn't have much strength and hasn't resisted. But since you asked, Kalat lifted his chin to a resistant soldier. The soldier found a pair of cuffs and walked over. After pulling Klein's hands back, he cuffed him. Klein continued wearing mixed emotions like before, trying hard to act like he was struggling despite having a lack of strength. Then, another gang member got some water and wiped his face with a rough towel. Thankfully, most of the makeup in this era isn't waterproof. Klein began changing his face's contours as the towel covered his face. Before long, Mithra saw Helene's moist face. She looked extraordinarily frail and beautiful in this state. Her emerald green eyes shot out with intense hatred and a look of perplexity. Unfortunately, she's captain's? Mithra's throat moved. As a man and a pirate, he often fantasized about Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy and red-haired Helene falling into his embrace at the same time, but of course, it was only his imagination. The way he looks at me is disgusting. Klein nearly puked. Although he knew that it was targeted at red-haired Helene and had nothing to do with him, he couldn't help but feel goosebumps. In that instant, he got to know the real him a little deeper. He knew what things he couldn't accept at all. It really is her. Mithra turned his head and said to Kalat, "This is your reward." He threw the tiny leather bag in his hand over to him. Kalat did a brief inspection and threw it to his subordinate. He pondered for a second and said, "We still need your help." "No problem. Seek out Oziel when needed." Mithra pointed to red-haired Helene in the room and asked, "I'll take her away, right?" "Yes." Kalat made way once again. Klein didn't wish to be helped by Mithra as he pretended to have regained some of his mobility while stumbling out. Mithra was afraid of Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy, so he could only hold her by her shoulder and lead her to the carriage parked outside. The carriage left the city and came to a private harbor. Mithra led Klein, who was disguised as red-haired Helene, onto a fishing boat which had been long prepared. Under the cover of the night, they left Byam. After about an hour, they saw a ship docked under the shadow of an island's cliff. Fluttering in the wind was a huge flag with white bones drawn on it. Black Death. Chapter 581. Both getting into character and detachment, only a single Black Death. The other ships are anchored beyond the Rørsted archipelago's confines because they're afraid of being discovered? This is good news. Klein retracted his gaze and deliberately bit his lip to express his agitation. After taking a glance at Helene's side profile, Mithra lit a torch and began swinging it to signal to the flagship. Before long, a dinghy came and took him and the disguised Klein back to the Black Death. As the dinghy was being hoisted up, Klein boarded another pirate admiral's flagship. Under Mithra's lead, he entered the cabin. Waiting for them up ahead was a blonde female attendant. She glanced at Helene with a cold stare before pointing sideways to the room. "Go in." This attitude, it's like meeting a love rival in the flesh. Both men and women fall to this Vice Admiral Ailment's charm. The cuffed Klein instantly increased his vigilance as he wore a heavy expression and followed the blonde female attendant into the room. He originally believed that he would immediately meet Tracy and obtain a chance to meet her in private. He was already ready to strike. But apart from a wardrobe, sofa, and full-body mirror in a cramped carpeted room, there was nothing. Could it be that Tracy has deliberately given Helene the cold shoulder to express her anger? Klein recalled the romance novels and contrived television serials he had previously watched while contemplating the reason for the ailment maiden's actions. The blonde female attendant shot a glance at Helene's male attire that lacked the androgynous beauty to it due to the lack of makeup, took 2 quick steps, opened the wardrobe, and pointed to the dresses inside. "Captain doesn't like your present attire. Change." Klein cursed inwardly. He originally imagined that he could be granted a meeting with Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy while looking like Helene and dressed as a male. He was thankful that he didn't need to overly humiliate himself to achieve his goal, but in the end, he didn't manage to escape this outcome that he wanted to avoid. Seeing Helene standing there in a daze, the blonde female attendant glared at her. "You have two choices. Either you change yourself, or I'll help you." Klein did one of red-haired Helene's habitual motions and inhaled slightly. "Remove my cuffs." He turned his body sideways and gestured with his chin towards the door. "And go outside." "Conniving whore." The blonde female attendant cursed under her breath and used the key given to her by Mither to release Helene from her cuffs. After she left the room and closed the door, Klein walked to the wardrobe and stood there in a daze for 20 seconds. Suddenly, he closed his eyes and extended his right hand. After an unknown period of time, he came in front of the full-body mirror and saw Helene's red hair cascading down in the reflection. Her green eyes shimmered while she wore a golden-red dress. By her waist was a ribbon tied into a flower. It was pulled tight, accentuating her slender waist. Helene's beautiful face was flushed red as her lips were tightly pursed. Her expression was heavy, looking very identical to the picture from before. Klein looked at his present image and first felt somewhat embarrassed. However, he had gotten over it to a certain extent while changing. Besides, there wasn't anyone inside. Second, he gradually found a different feeling. This wasn't to say that he was gradually liking such acts. Instead, while overcoming his mental aversion, he gained some form of detachment from his self-awareness. It felt like his soul had flown out of his body, allowing him to calmly observe Helene dressing up in female attire and adjusting her clothes through the mirror with a calm attitude. He believed this was a necessary step in his mission and that there was nothing embarrassing or odd about this. Klein felt a baffling sense of familiarity as he tried hard to recall and compare this feeling, in a bid to fix it in place and gain an understanding of it. Soon he found the source. This was similar to him playing role-playing games. In it, he could choose a female character, carefully choosing the facial features and attire of the character, allowing the beauty to please his eyes. There was nothing kinky or embarrassing while doing this. On the one hand, he was viewing it from an angle of a god through the screen, making his attitude detached, and on the other hand, he was seriously acting and going through the plot. By combining the two perfectly and not distinguishing between them, he didn't have any aversion to it because he was playing a game. Klein suddenly opened his half-closed eyes, feeling like this was the faceless state he had been searching for. He could act as anyone, but he was still only himself. As he got into character and worked hard to act, he could detach his feelings and observe things calmly. By making comparisons, he could figure himself out and find his true self. It's both getting into character and detachment. This is the actual application of the faceless main principle. Klein suddenly felt at peace as the remnant embarrassment coexisted with his changed attitude. With a detached attitude, as though he was playing a role-playing game, he observed himself in the full-body mirror and tried hard to find any flaws. Thankfully, I got Danitz to get 2 sets of female clothing to study the way it's all put together. Otherwise, there's no way I could wear them so quickly and normally as a first-timer. It will be easy to expose any flaws. This is called professionalism. Women's clothing sure is complicated. From the perspective of a faceless, there are many flaws in Helene's facial features and contours. She might be beautiful, but it's definitely nothing I call stunning. Yes, with this state of mind, I can clearly feel the potion digesting. Klein looked at himself in the mirror as though he was looking at a character named Helene. Thump, thump, thump. The blonde female attendant banged on the door and asked impatiently, "Are you not done?" Klein's face instantly sank, as though she hadn't returned him the 10,000 pounds she owed him. He maintained this state as he walked to the door and pulled it open. The blonde female attendant shot him a glance and raised the handcuffs. "Put your hands to your back. You're now a prisoner." As red-haired Helene was on the Black Death, she wasn't afraid that she would bring her any harm. All she wanted was to humiliate her as much as she could. Klein grunted and half-turned his body, putting his hands to his back. He felt relaxed because the woman wasn't paying too much attention to his attire. After putting on the cuffs, he was led by the blonde female attendant to the entrance of the captain's cabin. The door was half open, allowing a fragrance of warmth emanate outside. It wasn't too strong, but it was sufficiently long-lasting. It was a scent that kept pulling one back as they would involuntarily wish to head to bed for pleasure. The blonde female attendant knocked on the door and was just about to say a word when a gloomy but sufficiently beautiful female voice sounded from the inside. "Let her come in alone." The blonde attendant's face instantly sank as she pushed open the door, signaling with her eyes for Klein to enter. The moment of truth is here. Klein took a deep breath and stepped into the room. The door behind him closed with a thud, isolating the inside from the outside. Klein walked across the thick carpet and, using the candlelight from the golden candle racks, saw a rather beautiful lady sitting behind a desk while leaning back. She was wearing beige trousers with her feet extended diagonally while crossed. Her brows were long and straight, and her azure blue eyes were sharp and bright. She wore a white linen shirt, allowing her intimate body to faintly peek through. Raven-black curled hair cascaded down to hide the critical bits, making Klein instantly feel uncomfortable. Upon seeing red-haired Helene enter, Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy raised her left hand and asked with an ambiguous smile, "Tell me, how should I punish you?" She held a black leather whip in her hand. "Ma'am, there's always room for discussion." Klein lampooned to resist his discomfort. His eyes first moved upwards before leveling towards her. He said without a hint of emotion, "Returning to this place is already the greatest punishment. Anything else is just a bonus." "You're as stubborn as usual, yet always so indecisive." Tracy stood up. She was tall and slender, and under the illumination of the candlelight, her figure's shadows danced with extreme charm. She held back her smile and walked towards red-haired Helene, with the leather whip in her left hand. She didn't have an ounce of doubt. During this process, Klein noticed that she wore a bangle with inlaid diamonds on her right wrist. The mystical item described by Helene? It can reduce most forms of damage? Klein, who had originally planned to take action the moment the gap between them narrowed, held back his urge. "Oh, they cuffed you. That's nice. We haven't played such a game before," Tracy said with a smile, but her azure blue eyes seemed to be a stormy ocean that was gathering strength. "Ma'am, your lines are quite terrible." Klein pursed his lips tightly and didn't say a word. Tracy came in front of him and raised her right hand to slide down his cheek. "Returning is the greatest punishment?" As she spoke, her eyes turned misty, looking extremely alluring. "You usually don't seem to think so. Although you always resist in the beginning, you're often more passionate than me towards the end." Before she finished her sentence, Klein pulled out his left hand from the handcuff, and he grabbed the bangle on her wrist in a manner that was as fast as lightning. He then violently swiped it down. At the same time, that hand turned a shade of gold. Klein's green and deep eyes suddenly lit up with two bolts of lightning. This was creeping hunger. This was psychic piercing. And the ability to pull his hand out of the cuffs was a magician power. It was the bone-softening power which Klein very seldom used. He had long made plans and preparation for what he would do after infiltrating. It was to find a chance to be alone with Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy and assassinate her without holding back. Only by doing so did he have a chance of defeating a pirate admiral. Only by doing so could he severely injure and capture her. And even if it couldn't be done, he didn't mind killing her. He was already very accustomed to channeling spirits above the gray fog. He wasn't afraid of not being able to obtain the intelligence he needed. A human trafficker didn't deserve any pity. In addition, in order to prevent himself from tripping himself up, he only brought the most difficult-to-detect creeping hunger, which was good at disguising itself. The other mystical items were placed in the mysterious space above the gray fog. Furthermore, he was on the Black Death with several opposing Beyonders on board. He had to finish the battle as quickly as possible. This was also to avoid being taken down by Tracy's ailment powers. The longer he fought her, the worse the ailments inflicted on him would be. In that instant, the bangle with inlaid diamonds was removed from Tracy's wrist. Klein's green eyes flashed with lightning while the beautiful and charming Vice Admiral Ailment remained in a daze. All she did was instinctively dodge. She couldn't believe that Helene would attack her, or dare believe that she possessed such reactions and abilities. Chapter 582. Provocation, Tracy saw two bolts of lightning light up in Helene's beautiful emerald-like eyes as the blinding silver occupied her entire vision. Her beautifully contoured chin was suddenly lifted as though she was about to let out a tragic scream. However, she stiffened on the spot, shattering like a mirage. The full-body mirror placed in the room cracked and quickly crumbled, scattering to the floor. Mirror substitution spell. Tracy's figure, in her pure white shirt, beige trousers, and black leather boots, appeared in the corner where the full-body mirror was located. Before she could catch her breath, she heard heavy footsteps and saw red-haired Helene's dress fluttering to the back as she charged forward like a chariot. The glove she wore on her left hand was pale and gloomy green. Klein had already switched to a zombie state. His muscles were taut, and his strength had increased substantially. His sleeves fluttered as he clenched his fist tightly before throwing it at Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy like an iron hammer. Bang, bang, bang. Although he continued maintaining Helene's appearance, his actions were like a ferocious beast's. He was fierce and formidable. As he bombarded Tracy with his punches and kicks, all she could do was desperately parry his attacks without having the time to use other Beyonder powers. If a Demoness of Affliction's corresponding Sequence 9 was an assassin, allowing her to have extraordinary combat skills and dodging capabilities, this barrage of attacks would have left her heavily injured. Bang, bang, bang. Klein's fist emanated a white, frosty air, causing Tracy to tremble with every time she made contact. Gradually, ice began to form on the surface of her body. This was a zombie's mastery of frost powers. Seeing her blood gradually stiffen, Tracy didn't hesitate and took the blow. Her lips turned pale as her mouth opened slightly as she let out a formless scream. Accompanied by this scream, a blue illusory halo surged out from her body. It left stacked layers of frost in its wake. In just 1 or 2 seconds, both of them found themselves in a frozen world. They were surrounded by thick and transparent ice, and there was loose frost blanketing the exterior. The two looked very close to one another, but they needed to break through the various obstructions to fight each other. A smile appeared on Tracy's gallant and brilliant face as a silent black flame ignited within her body. It quickly melted the surrounding ice as it began to launch a counterattack, allowing Ailment Maiden to grasp the advantage. At this moment in time, she saw Helene, who was often frail and indecisive, snap her fingers without an expression. A matchstick she hadn't noticed lit up as scarlet flames leaped. Instantly, it enveloped the red-haired figure's dress. Tracy's pupils constricted as her spiritual intuition gave her an extreme sense of foreboding. In the silent black flames behind her, Klein leaped out in the form of Helene. He extended both his arms and hugged Tracy, locking her arms in the process. At the same time, he opened his mouth and shouted, "Bang!" A formless air bullet shot out with might that exceeded that of a revolver. It was comparable to the latest rifle models. It passed through the void and accurately hit the back of Tracy's head. The bullet drilled through her skull, but Vice Admiral Ailment's figure suddenly contracted, turning into a broken black staff. Magic staff substitution spell. Tracy rapidly appeared diagonally across him. The buttons on her shirt dropped as she revealed a mesmerizing view of fair skin. However, what caught Klein's attention wasn't that but the blood on her palm. While Klein restrained Tracy, she had clawed behind her, ripping off a piece of fabric and injuring his thigh. At this moment, Tracy quickly opened and closed her mouth twice as illusory black flames appeared from her palms to burn the blood. This was black magic, a witch's curse. Klein couldn't help but tremble. A black flame ignited from within, from his soles to the top of his head. He was rapidly reduced to paper shreds. Just as he appeared in another corner, he felt countless invisible spider webs swirl towards him. Some were hard and attempted to bind him, while others were soft, in a bid to stimulate different parts of his body. Klein, who was a Beyonder who acted extremely calm during combat, felt his heart race as his ears heated up. His body turned numb and sore, having the discomfort of a cold while having the urge to have his blood surge downwards. Compared to Madame Sharon from Tingen City, Tracy's spiderweb was far more terrifying. Klein didn't dare to underestimate it as he immediately snapped his fingers. The snap ignited all the surrounding spiderwebs as scarlet flames extended from where they came from and surged towards Tracy like a tidal wave. Back in Tingen, Klein already knew that the spiderwebs from a demoness of pleasure were weak against fire. Instantly, the middle of the room became a huge ignited web. Tracy was caught by surprise as the flames swept towards her. Humph! She exhaled as an eerie blue illusory light surged outwards and froze her within a transparent but gigantic crystal. The scarlet flames surged over and kept melting the ice, but it gradually weakened. Klein didn't pick up the diamond-inlaid bangle because he wasn't sure what negative side effects it might have. To rashly use a mystical item without sufficient comprehension of it was highly likely to be harmful rather than beneficial. He straightened his body and opened his arms, letting his left glove be dyed in the lustrous glow of the sun. Priest of Light. At that instant, Tracy, who was hiding inside the ice, felt that extremely familiar Helene wore a holy luster. In between her brows, an unprecedented tenacity surged out. She was pretty and no longer frail. Like a blooming sunflower, she was like a flower of war stained with blood. Tracy shouted with a clearly hoarse voice, "Who are you? Why don't you dare to show yourself? While wearing a dress, using my own looks would look so odd. It's more suitable to use Helene's appearance." Klein detached himself as this thought flashed through his mind. Following that, he praised the sun. A magnificent pure beam of light descended with golden flames swirling around it. It completely blanketed the ice and Tracy. As the ice rapidly melted and vanished at a discernible pace, the bright and holy light dimmed before disintegrating. The color in Tracy's face drained as she did a somersault and agilely dodged Klein's psychic piercing from his switch to the interrogator soul, letting whatever damage she received happen inside the beam of light. The light of holiness was strong against the undead and corrupt, so it was only considered an ordinary sequence 5 strike on a demoness. Bang, bang, bang. Tracy did multiple somersaults and dodged Klein's air bullets, leaving holes in the carpet. As she rolled, her figure vanished from her enemy's sight. A demoness invisibility. Klein bent his back slightly as he was on high guard. He then used his spiritual perception and his sense of danger as a clown to seek out Tracy's location. However, he was unable to find her in that short amount of time. Furthermore, his forehead was heating up and his lungs were burning. His throat hurt and itched. He nearly couldn't keep himself from coughing any longer. No, I can't let this drag out any longer. Klein's thoughts raced as he suddenly laughed deeply. He then used a stiff male's voice and said, "Helene told me your secrets. She also told me all of her secrets." Before he finished his sentence, his spiritual perception was triggered. This was because he discovered an intense emotional fluctuation in a particular corner. The emotions of rage and hatred were impossible to hide from him. Klein immediately turned around and looked over. Instantly, layers of golden scales appeared on his left glove. His eyes were tainted with a pale gold color as his pupils turned vertical. Silently, Tracy's figure was outlined as she wore a painful and twisted expression. Her extremely feminine raven-black curly hair grew uncontrollably as they spread in every direction. Psychiatrist's frenzy. Tracy, whose emotions had been stirred, nearly broke down when faced with such an attack. She temporarily lost her reasoning. Klein took the opportunity and snapped his fingers. An air bullet crossed the distance between them, heading straight for Tracy's face that remained beautiful despite the twisted expression. Suddenly, a wisp of thick raven-black hair swept over, changing the trajectory of the air bullet. It struck Tracy in the left shoulder, causing her clothes to tear and blood to spurt. Even her bones were exposed. Ugh! Tracy let out a shrill cry as immense amounts of black flames spewed out of her body and enveloped her. Following that, thick ice crystals formed outside the black flames. Beyond it, raven-black curly hair that frantically grew wrapped Tracy, the black flames, and the ice in thick layers. It seemed to form a gigantic cocoon made of human hair. Bang, bang, bang. Klein's air bullets shot out one after another, but they only penetrated the black hair and got stuck in the ice. He paused and made his left glove emit the brilliance of the sun. At that moment his throat itched. Unable to control himself any further, he began coughing violently. He failed to produce the attacks he was preparing to deliver. Inside the black-haired cocoon, Tracy had recovered her senses. She raised her voice and shouted sharply, "Enemy assault! Enemy assault!" At that instant, Klein paused for a second. In his moment of adrift thoughts, he felt as though he had returned to Backland, returning to the first time he encountered the devil dog. He knew he wasn't its match and could only shout, "Murder," and "Save me," before successfully escaping from the danger. At that moment in time, Tracy's cries had the same effect. Even if there weren't a dozen Beyonders on the Black Death, the number was close to that. Furthermore, there were relatively many Beyonders of relatively high sequences. Indeed, killing a pirate admiral in a short period of time is too difficult, even if it's an assassination. Klein coughed twice and snapped his fingers. He stopped attacking and hesitating. He turned and ran for the window in the captain's cabin. The last thing he noticed was the diamond-inlaid bangle, but he didn't dare to retrieve it. Firstly, he was afraid that the severe negative effects would affect his escape, and secondly, he was afraid that Tracy would be able to lead a bunch of Beyonders to pursue him with the help of the item's location after she recovered. A pursuit at sea would then unfold. "I can't be greedy." Klein turned his head and smashed through the window and fell onto the deck. Two pirates happened to come over as they thrust their cutlasses forward. Their cutlasses pierced through a paper figurine. Klein's figure instantly appeared behind one of the pirates, as he extended his left hand, opening up a ferocious and creepy mouth on his palm. Creeping hunger bit down on its food, while Klein lifted the pirate up before other Beyonders rushed over. He took wide steps and ran to the shipboard. Under gunfire, he plunged into the dark sea under the night sky. Chapter 583. Contingency Plan. The ice-cold water instantly inundated Klein, drenching his golden-red dress and making him sink like a rock. At the same time, creeping hunger had already finished eating the pirate, lightening his load. Klein didn't attempt to float up and had instead continued sinking downwards. He could faintly hear splashing sounds across the distant waves. Apparently, pirates from the sailor pathway had engaged in pursuit. This was their home ground. They could act like fish in such environments for a very long period of time. Klein wasn't alarmed. As a magician who never performed unprepared, he had obviously thought of his escape plans if he met with failure. After all, there was nothing guaranteed about such matters. To do his best acting as Helene and not be discovered by Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy, he had not only left the other mystical items and cache above the gray fog, but he had even done so for the charms that came under the water and wind domain that he recently made. However, this didn't affect him. As a god, a blessed, and a believer trinity, he had many miraculous methods to deal with the corresponding situation. He quickly made creeping hunger turn pale and be dyed in a gloomy green. The surrounding seawater froze, forming layers of frost. Before the frost completely turned into ice, Klein spread his wing muscles and spread out his arms. With the strength of a zombie, he shattered the frost, sending them slightly further away. This way, he temporarily produced a narrow space that didn't have any seawater around him. The water instantly surged backwards to fill the space. Klein extended his left palm and released the terrifying cold and spread it out, creating layers of ice walls. For a brief moment, he seemed to be encased in an ice prison. He could stand in it and produce sound, but he was only limited to that tiny space. Klein immediately took tiny steps in a counterclockwise fashion while murmuring, "Blessings stem from the celestial worthy of heaven and earth," before rapidly letting his spirit body go above the gray fog. Just as his body appeared at the fool's high-back chair, he immediately picked up the sea god scepter which he had placed on the table. Without needing to identify anything, he selected the point of light representing Gehrman Sparrow, who had recently been promoted to a believer of Sea God. Through a previously established connection, he raised the short milky white scepter and made the blue gems on it emit a blurry luster. He replied to his believer and augmented himself with all sorts of spells, including but not limited to underwater breathing, freedom of movement, and pressure resistance. Finally, he used a paper angel to interfere with any divination. He then ordered the nearby undersea creatures to help protect Gehrman Sparrow's escape. After doing all of this, Klein didn't delay and had immediately returned to the real world and gained control of his body. At that moment, the seawater's pressure had crushed the constantly melting ice wall and had retaken that independent space. However, Klein could already breathe easily and swim rapidly. Through the rippling but crystalline water, he saw fishes swimming towards him. A dark shadow rose up from beneath his feet as an unknown behemoth rapidly rose. It was a strange brownish-red creature that looked like a squid. It was so massive that its tentacles were enough to bind an entire ship. It spewed black ink and instantly dyed the surrounding sea black. The few sailor pathway beyonders who were pursuing Klein instantly saw black as their bodies turned numb. Unclear of what was happening, they immediately floated to the surface and dealt with the abnormalities in their bodies. By the time they dived down again to find the enemy, they had already lost track of Klein. At this moment, Klein was swimming at the bottom of the sea with great satisfaction. He even had the time to divert his attention to recall his failed operation and reflect on what he had done. I had sufficient preparations to act as Helene. Even Tracy, who had shared numerous nights with her on the same bed, couldn't instantly see through me. It accelerated the digestion of the potion. During this process, I still had to overcome my aversion and find a way to both get into character and be detached. This was extremely helpful to the digestion of the potion. I basically did the best I could for the battle. It can be considered a prepared performance, but I underestimated the strength of a sequence 5 Demoness of Affliction and the experience of someone who inched her way to becoming Vice Admiral Ailment. Even though she lost her mystical item in the beginning, just my present strength and my mystical item weren't enough to kill her quickly, unless I had used the Sea God Scepter. But this is around the Rorstad Archipelago. Through today's battle, I can clearly tell that I lack a mystical item with powerful offensive abilities. Facing the reality of a failed mission, Klein was no doubt somewhat disappointed. However, he wasn't depressed, because this wasn't the end of this matter. He planned on writing to Mr. Azek to see if he was interested in the ancient chronicles related to death and if he had the time to pay a visit. Before Klein left the captain's cabin, he had snapped his fingers to ignite the male clothing he had left in the changing room, as well as any hair or skin he had left behind. This was to make it seem like he didn't wish to leave any traces, but it was in fact a form of concealment and deceit. What he was concealing was the hair and button he had secretly thrown into a particular room without anyone noticing after he entered the cabin. Having wiped away any traces of himself, Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy would mistakenly believe that the assassin was afraid of exposing himself because of the fear of suffering a remote curse. Then, it would be difficult for her to seriously get the pirates to check for any remnant items. With the hair and button, Klein could use divination to lock onto the location of the Black Death up to a certain amount of time. This way, as long as Mr. Azek was willing, he could bring him to Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy. Sigh. I originally thought I wouldn't need Mr. Azek's help. I thought I could succeed just by myself, alone. Ultimately, I fell just short. Klein sighed and felt a blow to his self-esteem. This was one of the reasons why he didn't seek Mr. Azek's help in the beginning. The other reason was that he wasn't certain that Tracy was in possession of the ancient chronicles related to death. If she really didn't have it, it would be rather awkward to have Mr. Azek make a trip for nothing. Furthermore, he was worried that even with Mr. Azek's help, that he would still need to act as Helene to find the Black Death and Tracy. He still needed to wear her clothes and use himself as bait. That would be too embarrassing to do it in front of someone he knew. In fact, if it wasn't to obtain intelligence and solely to eliminate Vice Admiral Ailment Tracy, it would have been a lot simpler. Once I swim back to Byam and go above the gray fog, I simply need to lock onto their location and use the Sea God Scepter to create a storm. This isn't to say that a huge area of attack blast will definitely kill Tracy on the spot, but it will attract Sea King John Cotman's attention. When the time comes, the Black Death's location would be exposed to the Church of Storms. Sea King will happily take down Ailment Maiden. Klein shook his head with self-deprecating mockery. With his seer's spiritual intuition guiding him, he rapidly swam towards the shore. On the Black Death, Tracy removed her layers of defense and walked to the diamond-inlaid bangle, in her damaged, blood-stained clothes. She bent down to pick it up. What a cautious attacker. I might not even be comparable to her back when I was an assassin. Tracy suddenly clenched her teeth. This wasn't because she nearly died at his hands, but because he had sensed that the man had done something to Helene. According to the way Emperor Roselle put it, she suspected that there was something green growing on her head. Helene, are you really that cold and heartless? No, perhaps she was forced. Tracy turned her head to look at the nasty wound on her left shoulder as she felt the heart-wrenching pain. If not for the strengthening of her physique brought about by the assassin and instigator sequence, with a significant enhancement in subsequent sequences, just that one blow alone could have made her lose her entire arm. She would be like those pirates who had their arms blown off by rifles. As the blood flowed and stained her vision red, Tracy got the blonde female attendant to enter and use her abilities to help her deal with her injuries while instructing the surrounding pirates who had their eyes fixated on her to search for any items the attacker had left behind. Unfortunately, the pirates informed her that all of his clothes had been automatically destroyed. This made Tracy recall the snap the enemy had made before he left. She sighed once again. How careful! Furthermore, he's not one bit greedy. If he had taken the bangle, then I wouldn't need to worry about not catching up to him. Tracy waved her hand, motioning for most of the pirates to leave, leaving behind Worm-Tongue Mither King and a few high-ranking members of the crew. Third mate, go to Byam again. Perform a thorough investigation to figure out where the resistance found that Helene, Tracy ordered in a solemn voice. With great difficulty, Mither retracted his gaze from his captain's chest. All right. Tracy thought for a moment and added, spread this matter. Say that I'm seriously injured and will not be able to recover anytime soon. Also, first mate, immediately set sail. Don't stay here any longer. As she issued orders, silence was quickly restored around Tracy. Only at this point did she have the time to figure out which faction the attacker came from, why he would attack her, and what motives he had. Unfortunately, the more Tracy thought, the more puzzled she became. She had no idea what the truth was. Although she had many enemies, none of them possessed similar powers. Finally, she found a clue as she muttered to herself, creeping hunger? In the middle of the night, in a private harbor on Blue Mountain Island. Standing by the receding and advancing waves was a female figure. She was none other than Klein, who was still disguised as Helene. He circled under the water and quickly came onto shore. He infiltrated the house of a nearby fisherman and got some tattered clothes to change into before changing back into Gairman Sparrow. Leaving behind the rather expensive dress as compensation, Klein rapidly left the private harbor and returned to the city of Generosity, Byam, before daybreak. He wasn't in a rush to meet up with Danitz. Instead, he found a random motel to stay in. He used a ritual and brought back Azek's copper whistle, other mystical items, and cash back to the real world. After confirming that he could divine the location of the Black Death, he blew the copper whistle. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.